Hey guys, tonight we step off a creaking wooden boat and into a world where the wind never really rests, where sheep outnumber people, and where wool is less a fabric and more a philosophy. You're standing on the slick stones of a narrow harbor in the Faroe Islands, the North Atlantic breathing salt into your lungs as turf-roofed houses crouch low against the hills. The air tastes like sea spray and cold iron. Above you, clouds drag themselves across the sky in dramatic layers, as if auditioning for a brooding documentary. You probably won't survive this at least not without a very good sweater. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what the local time is. I love imagining this little map of night owls and early risers stretched across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The wind nudges you forward as you climb from the harbor up toward the village. The Faroe Islands sit roughly halfway between Norway and Iceland, and historically, they've belonged to the Danish crown since the late Middle Ages, though they retain a strong sense of autonomy today. Mainstream historians agree that Norse settlers arrived here in the 9th century, bringing with them sheep that would become the backbone of island life. And as you walk past a low stone wall patched with moss, you begin to understand why. There are almost no trees here. The landscape rolls in treeless waves of green and brown. Cliffs plunging into the ocean like giant slices of cake were windswept basalt and tasted faintly of existential endurance. Without forests, there's little timber for building or fuel. So you rely on what you have: grass, peat, stone, and sheep, especially sheep. A small flock grazes nearby, their thick fleece rippling as a gust barrels down the slope. The sheep look mildly offended by the weather, but also completely unfazed. This is their element. You watch as one lifts its head, chewing with philosophical calm. You suspect it knows something about survival that you don't. The village houses seem to grow out of the earth itself. Their walls are stone, their roofs layered with birch bark and sod, grass sprouting on top like a cozy haircut. Turf roofs are not just aesthetic choices for Instagram, they are practical insulation against cold and wind. The wool you'll soon spin and knit will serve the same purpose layer upon layer, trapping warmth in tiny air pockets. Nature's original puffer jacket, you push open a heavy wooden door and step inside one of these homes. The room is dim, lit by a small oil lamp. Smoke from a central hearth drifts lazily upward, blackening the rafters over generations. The smell is peat and lanolin, that faintly sweet, sheepish scent that clings to freshly shorn fleece. It's oddly comforting, like the olfactory equivalent of a weighted blanket. Here, wool isn't a hobby, it's survival. In a place where storms can roll in within minutes and winter daylight shrinks to a few pale hours, clothing must endure relentless moisture and biting wind. The Faroese sweater, often knit with intricate patterns you'll come to recognize, evolves to be dense, water-resistant, and astonishingly warm. Even today, traditional Faroese knitwear is prized for its functionality. That's not marketing fluff, it's centuries of trial and error stitched together. Historians still argue whether the earliest settlers found the islands completely uninhabited, or whether Irish monks had briefly settled here before the Vikings arrived. Archaeological hints like simple stone crosses suggest a pre-Norse presence, but regardless of who got here first, it's the Norse who anchor sheep into the cultural DNA of these islands. Sheep become currency, dowry, dinner, insulation, and occasionally the subject of neighborhood disputes that last longer than modern Wi-Fi contracts. You step back outside, the wind immediately reclaiming you. It whistles between houses, tugging at your cloak. The sound is constant a low, restless hum that villagers grow up with. Weather here is not background, it's a character. The Faroe Islands sit in the path of the North Atlantic current, which keeps temperatures milder than you'd expect at this latitude, but also ensures frequent storms and heavy rainfall. You don't really check the weather, you negotiate with it. A woman crosses the path ahead of you, her shawl pinned tight. She carries a basket lined with raw fleece, freshly shorn and still slightly damp. You notice how naturally she moves through the wind, leaning into gusts as if in quiet conversation. There's a rhythm to life here. Shear, spin, knit, mend, over and over. Generations repeating the same gestures with small variations, like a long, slow remix. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. In older Faroese belief, certain winds were said to carry hidden people, Holdefok, who disliked loud noises and sudden changes. Some families would avoid moving large stones or altering hillsides, just in case they disturbed these invisible neighbors. Imagine blaming your lost laundry on offended elves. It's oddly comforting. You wander toward the edge of the village where cliffs drop sharply into the sea. The Atlantic churns below, white foam tracing the dark rock. Fishing boats bob in the distance, tiny against the vastness. Men will head out there soon, wrapped in thick wool garments knit by hands like the woman you just passed. The wool must hold against spray and sleet. It must dry quickly. It must endure. You pull your own imaginary sweater tighter, grateful for every loop and twist of yarn. In this place, wool is architecture you can wear. Wind is a sculptor, carving patience into every one it touches. And weather unpredictable, relentless weather's the quiet ruler of it all. As the light begins to fade into a silvery dusk, you realize this is only your first breath of island life. The sheep graze, the wind hums, the hearth smoke rises, and you, bundled against the Atlantic chill, are just beginning to understand how deeply wool, wind, and weather are stitched into every Faroese story. The wind doesn't let up overnight. It rattles the turf roof in a steady rhythm, like a giant politely but persistently knocking to be let in. By morning, you're already aware that survival here depends less on bravado and more on preparation and on sheep. Always the sheep. You follow a narrow footpath out beyond the clustered houses, boots damp from mist that seems to float rather than fall. The hills roll outward in soft green swells, cropped short by generations of grazing. This is not accidental landscaping. When Norse settlers arrived in the 9th century, most likely from western Norway, they brought sheep with them in their longships, along with cattle, goats, and the cultural blueprint of Scandinavian farm life. The Faroe Islands offered grass in abundance, but almost no trees. Sheep, hardy and adaptable, were the obvious solution. Mainstream historians point to the Landni Mabok, the medieval Icelandic book of settlements, which references early Norse colonization across the North Atlantic, including these islands. Whether every detail is perfectly accurate is another matter medieval chroniclers warn. Exactly carrying clipboards, but archaeological evidence confirms that by the late 800s, sheep were firmly established here, and once they arrived, they multiplied like, well, sheep. You crest a hill and see them scattered across the slope, small, sturdy animals with thick, double-layered fleece. The outer coat is long and coarse, built to shed rain, while the underlayer is soft and insulating. This dual structure is not a fashion statement. It's a biological mic drop. The Faroese sheep breed, descended from Old Norse stock, adapts over centuries to the island's wet, windy climate. Selective breeding isn't a formal science yet, but practical farmers know which animals survive harsh winters and which don't. The resilient ones pass on their genes. Nature handles the rest with a brisk efficiency that would make any modern HR department blush. You crouch near a low stone enclosure, one of many scattered across the hills. These walls, some centuries old, guide and contain flocks during roundups. Sheep ownership quickly becomes a measure of wealth. In early Faroese society, land and livestock define status. A man with a large flock commands respect. A family with too few sheep faces real danger when winter tightens its grip. Historians still argue whether the initial sheep population was large enough to sustain the settlers immediately, or whether early years were marked by significant hardship and livestock loss. The climate can turn sharply cold, and fodder must be carefully stored. You imagine that first winter, wind howling, supplies dwindling, settlers eyeing their flocks with a mix of hope and anxiety. It's one thing to bring sheep across the ocean, it's another to keep them alive when horizontal rain becomes a personality trait. The sheep graze calmly now, nibbling at tough grasses and heather. They seem almost smug about their evolutionary success. You can't blame them. In a land with few predators, no native wolves or bears, the greatest threats are weather and human miscalculation. Occasionally, a sheep may tumble from a cliff, a grim reminder that gravity is undefeated, but overall, they thrive. A quirky tidbit drifts through your mind as you watch them. In some Faroese villages, sheep were once so integral to identity that families could recognize individual animals at a distance, not just by earmarks, but by subtle differences in gait and wool texture. It's like facial recognition software, except woolier and significantly less invasive. You walk with a farmer as he inspects the flock. He leans into the wind without thinking, cloak snapping behind him, he speaks of lambing season with the seriousness of a general planning a campaign. Timing matters. Too early and late frosts threaten newborn lambs. Too late, and they won't grow strong enough before autumn storms. The entire agricultural calendar bends around sheep reproduction and wool growth. In these early centuries, sheep provide nearly everything: meat, supplements, diets. Otherwise heavy on fish and dairy, skins line beds, bones become tools. But wool is the constant. It can be stored, traded, transformed. In a treeless environment where fuel is scarce and imported goods are rare, wool is both insulation and currency. You glance back toward the sea. The settlers who arrived here chose isolation, or perhaps isolation chose them. The North Atlantic is not a friendly neighbor. Boats must navigate treacherous currents and sudden storms. Once winter sets in, travel becomes even more perilous. That isolation fosters a kind of self-reliance that borders on stubbornness. If something breaks, you fix it. If clothing wears thin, you mend it. If you're cold, you add another layer, preferably made from the animal currently staring at you with mild curiosity. And here's where weather reasserts itself as the silent ruler. The Faroe Islands experience cool summers and relatively mild winters compared to mainland Scandinavia, thanks to the North Atlantic current, but mild is a relative term. Temperatures hover just above freezing in winter, and rain is frequent year-round. Wool's natural lanolin helps repel water, making it uniquely suited for this damp climate. You run your fingers through a lock of fleece and feel the slight oiliness. It's nature's raincoat. Modern outdoor brands would absolutely trademark this if they could. The farmer pauses, scanning the horizon. Clouds are thickening, sliding low over the peaks. Weather changes fast here, sometimes within minutes. You feel it tooth a subtle shift in air pressure, the wind sharpening. Sheep sense it as well. They cluster slightly closer together, instinctively seeking safety in numbers. There's a lesson there, if you're awake enough to catch it. As you head back toward the village, you realize that sheep are not just background scenery. They shape settlement patterns, labor divisions, even social hierarchies. A household's fortune rises and falls with its flock. Marriage negotiations consider livestock counts. Disputes over grazing rights can simmer for years. Wool threads its way through every conversation, every calculation. You glance once more at the hillside, dotted with white and brown forms against the green. In this treeless, wind-scoured landscape, sheep are the quiet architects of survival. They anchor the settlers to the land. They turn grass and rain into warmth and wealth. And as the first drops of a new shower tap against your hood, you can't help but feel a grudging respect for these stoic, slightly judgmental creatures. The wind picks up again, urging you downhill toward turf roofs and smoky hearths, where fleece will soon be cleaned, carded, and spun. The story is only beginning to twist into yarn. By the time you reach the village again, the rain has settled into that steady Faroe drizzle that feels less like falling water and more like the air itself has decided to moisturize you. You duck back inside a turf-roofed house, grateful for the low doorway that forces you to bow. Slightly whether in humility or simple architectural necessity is up for debate. From the outside, these homes look like grassy mounds with chimneys. From the inside, they feel like a cross between a burrow and a ship's cabin. Thick stone walls anchor the structure, while layers of birch bark and sod above your head act as insulation. This style of building stretches back to the Viking Age and continues in variations for centuries. Instead of one massive hall, you often find separate structures for living, storage, and animals. It's partly about fire safety, partly about efficiency, and mostly about not wanting your entire life to go up in smoke because someone got too enthusiastic with the peat. You sit near the hearth, where peat smolders with a low, earthy scent. Peat cutting is another essential task in this treeless environment. Blocks of compacted vegetation are sliced from bogs, dried, and burned for fuel. The smoke curls upward, staining beams black over generations. Your eyes sting slightly, but you quickly understand the trade-off. Smoke means warmth, and warmth means survival. Wool plays its part here too. Thick woven hangings sometimes line interior walls, adding an extra layer of insulation against the damp cold that seeps through stone. Blankets pile high on built-in bed platforms along the walls. At night, entire families may sleep in close proximity, sharing body heat beneath layers of wool. Privacy is minimal. Warmth is not. Historians still argue whether these homes were as perpetually smoky and uncomfortable as some. Archaeological interpretations suggest, or whether ventilation techniques, like roof openings and carefully managed hearths made them more livable than we assume. You suspect the truth lies somewhere in between. After all, people are remarkably good at adapting to conditions that would make modern building inspectors faint. Outside, the wind intensifies, rattling the wooden shutters. Turf roofs, heavy with soil and grass, press downward with reassuring weight. The living roof isn't just charming, it resists being torn away by gales. Grass roots knit the sod together, much like stitches in a sweater. You can help noticing the metaphor. Architecture and clothing both rely on interlocking fibers to trap air and defy the cold. The islanders essentially build giant wool hats for their houses. A quirky belief drifts through the room along with the smoke. Some pharaohs once held that certain storms were sent by offended spirits or were omens tied to community disputes. If a particularly fierce gale damaged a home, whispers might follow. Had someone broken a promise, neglected a tradition? It's a gentle reminder that in small communities, weather and morality can become strangely intertwined. When your world is this compact, everything feels connected even. The wind seems personal. You run your hand along a folded wool cloak resting near the fire. It's thick, slightly coarse, and faintly oily from lanolin. That oil not only repels water, but also helps resist dirt and bacteria. Keeping livestock close serves multiple purposes: protection from storms, easier access during harsh weather, and, conveniently, a little extra shared warmth. It's not glamorous, but neither is hypothermia. You're beginning to see that practicality trumps aesthetics here, though. Ironically, the result is quite beautiful in its own understated way. The layout of the village itself reflects wind patterns. Houses huddled together, positioned to shield one another from prevailing gales. Narrow lanes snake between them, reducing exposure. This isn't random sprawl. It's communal engineering shaped by centuries of observation. You imagine early settlers experimenting placing a structure slightly higher on a slope, only to watch it endure the full force of a winter storm. You step back outside briefly, cloak pulled tight. Rain beads on the wool surface before rolling off in tiny droplets. The village looks almost like a cluster of green-backed creatures resting against the hillside. Sheep graze nearby, unconcerned. Smoke threads upward from chimneys, dissolving into low clouds. The Atlantic roars in the distance, a constant bass note beneath everything. There's a quiet intelligence to how these people build. They don't attempt to conquer the environment. They negotiate with it. Turf houses and wool garments are not acts of defiance, but of cooperation. The wind will blow, the rain will fall. The temperature will hover in that uncomfortable zone where you're never quite sure if it's autumn or an extended mood swing. So you adapt. You duck back inside as another gust sweeps through. The door thuds shut, and the interior settles into its smoky hush. You realize that in this world, survival isn't about dramatic heroics. It's about layers of turf, of wool, of community. Each layer compensates for what the others lack. And as the hearth crackles softly, you can almost feel the centuries pressing down gently, like that sod roof above you, steady, insulating, patient. The wind may rage, but inside these thick walls, wrapped in wool and peat smoke, life continues in stubborn, quietly brilliant ways. Morning arrives here not with a blaze of sunlight, but with a gradual lightening of gray. The wind has shifted. It's softer now, almost like it's taking a quick tea break before its next big performance. As I step outside, the village is already stirring. Today is shearing day, and that means the entire rhythm of life here tightens into focus. Spring shearing is absolutely essential. By late May or early June, as temperatures finally inch upward, and the grass grows thick across the hills. The sheep must be relieved of their heavy winter coats. If you leave the fleece on for too long, the animals risk overheating or collecting too much moisture in the warmer, wetter months. So, shearing is both practical and preventative-like, switching from a heavy winter duvet to a light summer blanket. Except this duvet is alive and occasionally tries to run away. Historically, shearing in the Faroe Islands is a communal affair. Families gather to help one another, moving from flock to flock over several days. This cooperation isn't just about being neighborly, it's a genuine survival strategy. A single household would struggle to manage hundreds of sheep all on their own. But when everyone works together, the village becomes an efficient fleece harvesting machine. I follow a group heading uphill toward a stone sheepfold. The structure is circular, built from stacked rocks that have endured more storms than I can even count. Inside, the sheep are clustered together, clearly uneasy. They sense that something unusual is about to happen. Their bleating echoes against the stones, a chorus of mild protest filling the air. Looking back through history, it's clear that sheep farming has been central to Faroe's life for over 1,000 years. Even as the world modernized, wool production remained a significant cultural and economic element. Eventually, fishing would overtake farming as the dominant industry. But the sheep never disappeared from the landscape or the identity of these islands. They are a constant, a living thread woven through time. I watch as a farmer deftly catches a sheep and positions it for shearing. Centuries ago, they would have used large, hand-forged iron shears, sharpened with immense care. The blades glide close to the skin in long, practiced strokes. There's a real art to it. If you cut too shallow, you leave too much fleece behind. Too deep, and you risk nicking the animal. The goal is always a balance of efficiency and care. It's interesting historians still debate whether early Faroese shearing techniques were directly imported from Norway, or if they evolved uniquely over time because of the local conditions. The sheer isolation of these islands suggests that some methods had to diverge. Tools would break and techniques would have to adapt. In a place where importing replacements could take months, innovation isn't just a good idea, it's a necessity. As the fleece peels away in thick, continuous sheets, I notice its layered structure against the coarse outer fibers and the much softer undercoat beneath. This duality makes Faroese wool particularly suited for knitting garments that can withstand the damp, persistent wind. It's certainly not the softest wool in the world, but it's among the most durable. I suspect no one here was ever prioritizing luxury softness over the very practical need of not freezing to death. While I'm here, a quirky custom surfaces in a nearby conversation. In some villages, the very first shorn fleece of the season might be set aside for a special garment, or even used in small rituals meant to ensure a good year ahead. These old superstitions still linger in subtle ways. Maybe a scrap of wool is tucked into a child's cradle for warmth and luck, or perhaps a particularly fine fleece sparks a quiet sense of pride, as if the sheep itself deserves a round of applause. I decide to lend a hand, gathering the freshly shorn fleece into piles. It's heavier than I expected, dense and slightly damp with residual lanolin. The smell is earthy and faintly sweet. My fingers quickly grow sticky. Congratulations to my, now officially smell like a walking cardigan. By midday, the sun makes a rare and welcome appearance, slicing through the clouds in pale silvery beams. The newly shorn sheep look so much smaller, almost embarrassed, like someone who's just had an overly ambitious haircut. They shake themselves off and wander away to graze, noticeably lighter on their feet. I'm told that an autumn shearing is sometimes practiced as well, depending on the flock and the weather that year. The timing of everything here is flexible. The weather dictates it all. A sudden cold snap can disrupt plans completely. A prolonged wet period can delay the work for days. In the Faroe Islands, the calendar isn't a rigid grid. It's a constant negotiation with the wind and the grass. This communal aspect of shearing does so much to strengthen social bonds. As hands work, stories begin to flow. News travels from one person to another. Disputes are aired and occasionally even resolved right here on the hillside. This shared labor reduces the isolation that can so easily creep in when you live in a landscape that feels this vast and lonely. Children dart around the edges, tasked with smaller jobs like collecting stray tufts of wool or fetching tools. They learn by watching, absorbing the movements that will one day become second nature to them, too. I take a moment to pause and look across the hillside. Beyond the sheepfold, the ocean glints faintly in the distance. Clouds drift in layered formations, casting shifting shadows over the green land. It's beautiful. In a very restrained way, there are no dramatic forests or fields of bright wildflowers, just subtle textures and constant gentle motion. And the weather, as always, hovers in the background of every activity. A sudden gust sweeps through, scattering loose bits of wool like pale feathers. Laughter rises as someone playfully chases a drifting clump downhill. It strikes me how this entire process, the shearing, the gathering, the preparing of the fleece, all of it, depends on finding these small windows of relative calm. Too much rain, and the wool becomes heavy and difficult to handle. Too much wind, and it simply vanishes into the next parish over. By late afternoon, the huge piles of fleece are bundled up for transport back down to the village. The work is physical, but it's oddly satisfying. They're a visible result for all the effort. The sheep are relieved of their heavy coats. The wool is stacked high, and the promise of warmth is stored away for the colder months to come. As I walk downhill with the others, my arms full of fleece, I feel woven into something much older than memory. This very ritual has been repeated for centuries. Generations of people have stood right where I'm standing, their hands sticky with lanolin, their eyes scanning the sky for signs of changing weather. The wind begins to rise again, right on cue. I tighten my grip on the bundle of wool. The village waits below. Its hearths ready, its spinning wheels soon to hum. Today's shearing is only the first step. The raw wool still holds the scent of the sheep and the hillside. Soon, it will pass through careful hands, transforming from a tangled fleece into thread that will become sweaters, blankets, and quiet shields against the ever-watchful Atlantic. And as the first cool hint of evening slips into the air, I realize that in this place, even the simple act of cutting wool feels like part of a larger patient dance between the grass, the animals, the people, and the wind. Thanks for joining me on this journey today. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from the edge of the world. By the time dusk settles, the village has taken on that muted glow that only peat smoke and low clouds can produce. Inside the turf house, the day's fleece lies in soft heaps along the wall, waiting for its next transformation. You sit near the hearth again, sleeves rolled as the first stage begins, cleaning and sorting. Raw wool, straight from the sheep's back, is full of surprises. Bits of grass, burrs, the occasional stubborn twiggle, tangled in the fibers like tiny souvenirs from the hillside. You pick through it methodically, teasing apart clumps. The lanolin makes your fingers slightly slick, but it also keeps the fibers resilient. There's something soothing about the repetitive motion. Pull, shake, separate, over and over. In earlier centuries, washing wool in the Faroe Islands often involves cold water from streams rather than heated baths. Fuel is precious, after all. The fleece is rinsed carefully to remove excess dirt while preserving enough natural oil to maintain its weather resistance. You carry a bundle down to a nearby stream, the water running clear and brisk over smooth stones. The cold bites your hands instantly. This is not a spa treatment, this is commitment. Mainstream historians note that wool processing in medieval North Atlantic communities follows broadly similar steps: washing, drying, carding, spinning, weaving, or knitting. Yet isolation shapes subtle differences. In the Faroes, the damp climate requires extra vigilance. When drying fleece, leave it to long and humid air and it can mildew. So timing becomes a quiet skill knowing when a breeze is dry enough, when a brief patch of sun is worth exploiting. Historians still argue whether knitting, as opposed to weaving, becomes dominant here earlier than in some other regions. Knitting spreads across Europe in the late medieval period, but its exact arrival in the Faroe Islands is debated. Some suggest trade contacts with Scotland or Norway introduce certain techniques. Others believe local innovation plays a larger role than previously assumed. Either way, by the early modern period, knitting is firmly embedded in Faroese life. Back inside, the wool has dried enough to card. 2 wooden paddles studded with metal teeth carders, drawn against each other, combing the fibers into alignment. The motion is rhythmic, almost hypnotic. You draw the carders apart, and a soft, airy roll of wool forms between them. It's called a rollag, and it looks like a small cloud that decided to nap in your lap. The room fills gradually with others. Women settle onto benches, children curl near the wall, an older man mends a tool by the fire. This is evening work. After tending animals and fields, spinning becomes the quiet second shift. A spindle or spinning wheel appears. You take a seat, rowlag in hand. The spinning wheel hums as it turns, a low worry sound that blends with the crackle of peat. You draft fibers gently, feeding them into twist. Twist is everything. Too little, and the yarn falls apart. Too much, and it kinks like an over-caffeinated snake. Your fingers learn to feel the balance. The yarn winds onto the spindle, growing steadily. Here, in the glow of firelight, wool becomes thread, and thread becomes potential. A quirky belief floats through the conversation. Some islanders once held that spinning after a certain hour on particular holy days could invite misfortune. Not catastrophe, exactly just the kind of mild, persistent inconvenience that makes you suspect the universe is side-eyeing you. So the rhythm of spinning sometimes bends around church calendars and local customs. You can't help imagining someone blaming a dropped spindle on supernatural scheduling conflicts. You glance up at the rafters, blackened by decades of smoke. Soot drifts down occasionally, settling into wool piles. It's imperfect. Nothing here is pristine. But perhaps that's part of the charm. The yarn you spin carries faint traces of peat smoke and hearth warmth. When it's later knit into garments, it will hold that memory close to the skin. Weather presses against the walls, again, a soft patter of rain. Inside, the circle tightens. Stories begin. Tales of storms survived, of sheep lost and found, of fishermen who returned just before a squall turned vicious. The act of spinning frees the tongue. Hands are busy, minds wander. You notice how skill levels vary. An older woman's yarn emerges impossibly even fine and strong. Yours wobbles slightly thicker in places. She smiles, adjusts your grip, shows you how to let the twist travel more smoothly. Knowledge passes not through formal lessons, but through proximity and patience. Wool production, you realize, is not just economic labor, it's social glue. It fills long winter evenings when darkness stretches for hours. It provides purpose during storms that keep boats ashore. It ensures that even when wind isolates the islands physically, the interior of a home remains warm with shared activity. And there's an understated authority here. The ability to spin consistent, durable yarn is power. Garments depend on it. Trade may depend on it. A household known for high-quality yarn earns quiet respect. No flashy medals, require just sweaters that don't unravel in a gale. Outside, the wind rises briefly, rattling the door. You pause, listening. The sound no longer feels threatening. It's simply part of the soundtrack. The spinning wheel continues its steady hum, indifferent to gusts. As the evening deepens, the pile of raw fleece shrinks, replaced by neatly wound skeins of yarn. Each skein represents hours of labor, centuries of inherited knowledge, and the unspoken agreement between humans and sheep. Grass becomes fleece, fleece becomes yarn, yarn becomes warmth. You lean back, hands tired but satisfied. In the quiet glow of the hearth, with smoke curling lazily upward and yarn coiling at your feet, you sense the continuity of it all. The wind may reshape the cliffs outside. Rain may soak the hills. But here, inside these turf walls, thread by thread, the village answers weather with wool. And the night stretches on, patient and steady, as the wheel keeps turning. By morning, the skeins you spun last night hang from wooden pegs, pale and slightly uneven, like a row of quiet accomplishments. The rain has cleared, leaving the hills washed and gleaming. Today, the village turns its attention to color. You step outside with a small group carrying baskets of yarn and simple tools. The air smells cleaner after the storm, tinged with salt and damp grass. If you expected bright dye vats and jewel tones, you might be mildly disappointed. Faroe's wool traditionally favors earthy shades, soft browns, grays, muted blues, mossy greens. The landscape itself sets the palette. Mainstream historians agree that natural dyes dominate European textile production well into the 19th century, and the Faroe Islands are no exception. With limited access to imported pigments, islanders rely on what grows or washes ashore. Lichens cling to rocks and pale crusts. Seaweed tangles along the tide line. Certain plants on the moors yield subtle yellows and browns. Even peat and iron-rich water influence final hues. You crouch near a rocky outcrop where lichens spread like abstract maps. Carefully, you scrape a small amount into a pouch. Lichens are slow-growing, so harvesting must be cautious, another quiet negotiation with nature. When processed properly, some lichens can produce surprisingly rich purples or rusty oranges. The chemistry feels almost magical, though it's grounded in patient experimentation, passed down through generations. Historians still argue whether specific dye techniques here were independently refined or borrowed through trade contacts with Scotland, Norway, or Shetland. The North Atlantic may seem isolating, but it is also a corridor. Boats carry not only goods, but ideas. A subtle shift in color preference might trace back to a single trader's suggestions centuries ago. Back in the village, iron cauldrons are set over low fires. Water is drawn from a stream, slightly tinted by minerals from the soil. You add your gathered lichens, watching as the mixture begins to simmer. The smell is earthy, sharp, faintly briny. It's not exactly perfume counter material, but it has a raw honesty to it. A quirky tidbit surfaces as someone mentions an old belief. Certain dye plants were thought to carry protective qualities. A garment tinted with a particular moss might guard against illness or misfortune at sea. Whether that belief ever saved anyone is impossible to prove. But when your loved ones head into unpredictable waters, you take comfort where you can have it. If it's in a slightly green sweater, the yarn is carefully lowered into the steaming bath. You stir gently with a wooden stick, watching as pale fibers begin to absorb color. There's a quiet suspense to it. Natural dyes are famously unpredictable. The shade emerging from the pot can shift depending on water composition, temperature, even the mood of the weather. At least that's how it feels. Weather, of course, continues to hover in every calculation. Dyeing requires relatively stable conditions. Too much wind cools the vat too quickly. A sudden rainstorm can dilute the mixture if you're working outdoors. You find yourself glancing at the sky more often than at the pot, as if clouds are silent supervisors of the entire process. Once dyed, the yarn must dry. Lines are strung between posts, and skeins hang in gentle loops. Against the green hillside, they look like soft banners. Browns echo the peat banks. Grays mirror the sea under overcast skies. A faint yellow glows like distant sunlight filtered through cloud. You run your fingers over a drying skein. The fibers feel slightly rougher now, but strong. Color deepens as it dries, settling into a subdued richness. These aren't flashy hues meant to impress strangers at a marketplace in Paris. They are practical, forgiving shades that hide dirt and blend with the landscape, camouflage for everyday life. It's worth noting that undyed wool also remains common. The natural colors of Faroe's sheep white, brown, black, and various mottled combinations offer a built-in spectrum. Some of the most iconic Faroese knitting patterns rely on the contrast between these natural tones rather than heavy dyeing. Efficiency meets aesthetics in a very understated handshake. As you help turn the skeins so they dry evenly, you realize how much patience this process demands. There's no rushing it, no turning up a thermostat or activating a spin cycle. The wind assists, lifting strands gently while the cool air draws out moisture. For once, weather's collaborator rather than adversary, children wander past, pointing at particularly vivid skeins. An older woman inspects the color critically, nodding approval at one batch and muttering that another could have used just a touch more time. Expertise here is subtle but sharp. You can't fake centuries of textile wisdom. The afternoon light shifts, casting long shadows. The dyed yarn sways slightly in a new breeze. You think about how these colors will soon become patterns bands across shoulders, geometric motifs near cuffs. Though the shades are muted, they carry depth, layered with memory of moor and shore. In a land defined by wind and water, even color is negotiated. It must withstand washing, wear, and relentless dampness. It must not bleed or fade too quickly. The chemistry of lichens and seaweed becomes as vital as the shears used in spring. As the last skeins are gathered and brought back inside, the house feels warmer somehow, richer. Rows of colored yarn rest neatly, waiting for needles. Outside, clouds gather again, drifting low over the cliffs. The Atlantic murmurs in the distance. You pause at the doorway, looking out at the rolling hills dotted with sheep. Grass becomes fleece, fleece becomes yarn, yarn becomes color, and color, shaped by wind and moor, will soon become garments that carry the entire landscape on their surface. The transformation continues, steady and unhurried, like the tide itself. The dyed skeins rest in a wicker basket beside you, their muted tones catching the low afternoon light. Now comes the part where yarn becomes language. You You settle onto a bench near the doorway, where daylight is strongest. In your hands are slender wooden needles, smooth from years of use. Across from you, an older woman begins casting on stitches with the kind of casual precision that suggests she could do this in her sleep hand, possibly has. The first rows are plain, a foundation, but soon, contrasting yarn is introduced, and patterns begin to bloom across the growing fabric. Faroe's knitting patterns are not random decoration. They often echo the landscape. Small diamonds reminiscent of fishnets, zigzags like mountain ridges, repeating crosses that may reflect older Nordic motifs. While the Faroe Islands share stylistic similarities with other North Atlantic traditions, their designs evolve distinct identities over time. By the 19th century, recognizable regional patterns emerge, some tied to specific villages. Faroese knitters adopt and adapt these techniques, producing dense garments ideal for resisting wind. The floats of yarn carried behind the pattern add extra insulation. It's essentially built-in thermal layering. You're not just making a sweater, you're engineering a wearable fortress. Historians still argue whether certain motifs hold symbolic meanings or whether modern interpretations have layered significance. Onto what were originally practical geometric forms. Was that repeated cross meant as spiritual protection, or simply the easiest way to alternate light and dark yarn? The debate remains open, and perhaps that ambiguity is part of the charm. You focus on your own stitches. Knit, purl, change color, carry yarn across the back. The rhythm settles in quickly. There's something almost meditative about watching a pattern emerge row by row. Unlike weaving, where the design can be more abstract until complete, knitting reveals its intention gradually. It's like uncovering a story, one sentence at a time. A gust of wind pushes against the open door, making the yarn tremble in your lap. You instinctively tighten your grip. Even here, weather insists on participation. The sweater you're reshaping must account for that wind must hug the body closely at cuffs and collar, must sit comfortably beneath a heavier outer layer. Traditionally, Faroese sweaters are knit in the round, meaning the body is worked as a continuous tube. This reduces seams, which can let in cold air or water. The construction is clever in its simplicity. You imagine generations refining these details not in design studios, but through lived experience. A seam that chafes during a storm at sea won't survive long in collective memory. A quirky story circulates as you work. Some villagers once believed that dropping stitches repeatedly during knitting was a sign that someone nearby was speaking ill of you. Imagine pausing mid-sweater to glare suspiciously at your neighbor. It's both mildly paranoid and oddly adorable. As the garment grows, you see how color placement matters. Darker shades cluster around areas most exposed to work-offs. Shoulders while, lighter patterns highlight the chest and upper arms. This isn't just aesthetic balance, it's practical camouflage for dirt and fish scales, should the sweater travel to sea. The Faroese term for traditional knitwear, farusktroige, becomes more common in later centuries as national identity strengthens. Clothing shifts from purely functional to quietly symbolic. Wearing a locally knit sweater can signal belonging. It says you are part of this wind-bent community. Children nearby attempt their first stitches, tongues peeking out in concentration. Mistakes are gently corrected. No one scolds. Errors are simply unraveled and tried again. Patience threads through the room as steadily as yarn. You pause to stretch your fingers, glancing outside. The sky is layered in shifting grays, sunlight piercing through in narrow beams that spotlight patches of hillside. Sheep grays, now in their shorter coats, looking slightly more aerodynamic. The ocean beyond is restless but not angry. Knitting continues into evening. The hearth is stoked, shadows deepening around the room's edges. Your sweater has reached the chest now, the pattern fully established. Each stitch locks into the next, creating a fabric that resists unraveling. There's a metaphor there about community, but you're too relaxed to chase it too hard. It's worth noting that while much of this work falls to women, men also knit in various periods of Faroe's history, particularly when fishing seasons leave them ashore. The division of labor is practical rather than rigid. When survival depends on warm clothing, everyone learns the basics. You hold the sweater up briefly, examining it. It's not perfect. A slight tension change here, a minor irregularity there, but it feels solid, dependable, the kind of garment that will endure years of wind and spray. As night settles fully, conversation softens. Needles click in steady counterpoint to the crackle of peat. Outside, the wind resumes its low hum, brushing against turf roofs and stone walls. Inside, patterns multiply, quiet and deliberate. You lower your gaze back to the growing fabric. In each diamond and stripe, you see cliffs, waves, and the steady resilience of sheep on a hillside. The landscape is not just outside these walls. It's being recreated loop by loop in your hands. And somewhere between one stitch and the next, you realize that in this village, knitting is less about fashion and more about memory of weather endured, of colors gathered from moor and shore, of hands that worked before yours. The sweater grows heavier in your lap, warm, even unfinished, a small, portable shield against the Atlantic's endless breath. The sweater in your lap is nearly complete when the conversation shifts from patterns to passage. Not the kind involving dropped stitches or suspicious gossip, but the kind that involves boats, currents, and the unnerving width of the North Atlantic. You set your knitting aside and step outside with a small group heading toward the harbor. The wind is brisk but manageable, and the sea, while never exactly calm, seems to be in a cooperative mood. Down by the water, a wooden boat is being prepared for departure. Bundles wrapped in oilskin sit stacked near the stern. You recognize the careful bulk of folded wool garments inside. For centuries, Faroe's wool has not remained confined to these cliffs. Trade routes stretch outward primarily toward Norway, later toward Denmark and other parts of the North Atlantic world. In the medieval period, the islands become part of the Norwegian kingdom, and eventually, through the Kalmar Union and subsequent political shifts, fall under Danish control. Throughout these changes, wool remains one of the island's key exports. Mainstream historians point out that by the 13th and 14th centuries, stockfish share-dried cod joins wool as a crucial trade commodity. But wool holds a special versatility. It can be transformed into finished garments or traded as raw fleece or yarn. In a region where winters are long and damp, durable knitwear is valuable currency. You watch as sailors inspect the sky. Navigating these waters requires skill and nerve. The Faroe Islands lie along important North Atlantic routes, but they are also surrounded by unpredictable currents and sudden squalls. Weather forecasting in this era involves observation, inherited knowledge, and a healthy dose of hope. Historians still argue about the scale of Faroe's trade in certain centuries, whether it was modest and sporadic or more integrated into broader Scandinavian networks than previously believed. Archaeological finds of imported good ceramics, metal tools, even traces of foreign textiles suggest that these islands were never as isolated as their geography implies. A sailor lifts one of the wool bundles, testing its weight. The sweaters inside are thick, patterned, and tightly knit. They represent hours of labor by firelight. Once sold or traded abroad, they carry a piece of the islands with them. Imagine some fisherman in Bergen or a trader in Copenhagen pulling on a Faroese sweater and unknowingly wrapping himself in the scent of peat smoke and sea wind. You step closer to the water's edge. The harbor is small, sheltered by natural rock formations. Boats here are built sturdy, often clinker-built in the Nordic style, with overlapping planks for flexibility in rough seas. Wood must be imported or salvaged carefully, making each vessel precious. There is no casual boat ownership here. Each one is a lifeline. A quirky story surfaces from one of the older villagers. In certain eras, it was said that a particularly fine wool garment could influence a trade negotiation more effectively than long speeches. Present a trader with a sweater that withstands salt spray and biting wind, and you've made your argument. It's essentially medieval marketing, no glossy brochures required. As preparations continue, you notice how weather intrudes even now. A bank of darker clouds forms low on the horizon. The sailors confer quietly. Departure times are fluid, adjusted to wind direction and tide. There is no rigid timetable. The sea decides, you imagine the journey outward. The boat pitching gently at first, then more sharply as it leaves the shelter of the harbor. Spray dampening decks, the wool garments below deck, absorbing faint hints of salt. Trade voyages can last days or weeks, depending on destination and conditions. Risks are real. Storms can rise with little warning. Navigation relies on landmarks, stars, and deep familiarity with currents. Wool, ironically, plays a role even in these voyages. Sailors wear thick-knit garments to shield against cold and moisture. The same patterns you've been stitching by the hearth now wrap around men braving open water. Function merges with identity. A Faroe sweater at sea is both practical gear and quiet declaration of origin. You turn back toward the village briefly. From this angle, the turf roofs blend into the hillside so completely that houses seem almost hidden. Smoke trails upward, faint against the sky. Sheep graze as if unaware that their fleece is about to cross oceans. Trade brings more than goods. It brings stories, news, occasional rumors that ripple through the community. Political changes in distant capitals Oslo, Copenhagen filter slowly back here. Taxes, regulations, new trade restrictions may follow. But for now, the focus is simple. Load the wool, judge the wind, trust the boat. The sailors push off at last, oars dipping into dark water. The boat glides outward, then angles toward open sea. You feel a small tightening in your chest as it clears the harbor's embrace. It's not melodrama. It's the honest recognition that the Atlantic is powerful and indifferent. As the vessel shrinks against the horizon, you're left with a steady rhythm of waves against rock. The village resumes its quieter pace. More wool waits to be spun, more garments to be knit. Trade is cyclical, like shearing, like seasons. You realize that these fragile boats connect the Faroes to a wider world, even as wind and weather constantly threaten to sever that link. Wu becomes ambassador, crossing waters that sheep themselves will never see. The clouds thicken again, dimming the afternoon light. You pull your sweater closer, grateful for its weight. Somewhere beyond the gray line of sea and sky, bundles of Faroese wool ride the swell, carrying warmth into uncertain distances, and back on shore, beneath turf roofs and shifting clouds, the spinning wheel will turn again tonight. The boat is barely a memory on the horizon when talk in the village shifts, as it often does, to rules. Not the gentle, unspoken rules of knitting tension or shearing etiquette, but the official kind. Stamped with royal authority and carried across the sea, you're back inside by the hearth, where a visitor has arrived with news from Copenhagen. The Faroe Islands have been under Danish control since the late Middle Ages, formally ceded to the Danish crown after the dissolution of the union between Denmark and Norway in 1814. Even before that, Danish influence had shaped trade and governance. For villagers whose daily lives revolve around sheep and weather, distant monarchs can feel abstract until taxes are involved. Mainstream historians record that in 1709, the Danish crown established a formal trade monopoly over the Faroe Islands. Known as the Royal Danish Trade Monopoly, it restricted commerce to authorized merchants. Islanders were required to sell their goods wool knitted garments. Fish through this controlled system and to purchase imported goods from monopoly traders. They become entries in ledgers far from these cliffs. Historians still argue whether the monopoly system ultimately stabilized the Faroe economy or hindered its development. Some suggest it prevented exploitation and guaranteed access to grain and essential imports. Others argue it suppressed local initiative and kept prices artificially low for island producers. Like most historical debates, the truth likely weaves somewhere between you step outside briefly, letting cool air clear your thoughts. Sheep graze on the hillside as they always have, blissfully unaware of royal decrees. Grass grows, fleece thickens. The wind continues its endless patrol. And yet, the value of that fleece is now partially determined by policies crafted in ornate rooms hundreds of miles away. Back inside, tension simmers quietly. Wool is labor-intensive. Each skein represents hours of spinning. Each sweater, days of knitting. When monopoly agents undervalue these goods, frustration follows. Whether this was widespread or exaggerated by later storytelling is unclear, but it paints a picture of quiet negotiation. Islanders are nothing if not resourceful. Weather, as always, adds another layer of complexity. A storm-heavy season can reduce sheep numbers, lowering wool output. If quotas remain unchanged, pressure mounts. If imported grain shipments are delayed by rough seas, dependence on the monopoly feels more precarious. You begin to see how climate and policy intertwine, tightening like opposing currents. The hearth crackles as a woman resumes knitting, her movements steady despite the discussion. A sweater can carry a visual declaration of origin, even if sold under a royal stamp. Outside, clouds thicken once more, dragging low across the peaks. The wind sharpens, rattling shutters. You feel the familiar reminder that no decree can command the weather. Kings may regulate trade, but they cannot calm a gale or guarantee a mild winter. The monopoly era will last well into the 19th century, formally ending in 1856. Its legacy remains debated. Did it slow economic diversification? Did it shield the islands from harsher exploitation? Scholars continue to sift records and correspondence, trying to untangle impact from intention. Inside the turf house, the conversation softens. Practical matters reclaim attention. How much wool remains from last shearing? How many sweaters are promised for the next shipment? Life here balances between compliance and quiet autonomy. You glance at your growing sweater, its pattern steady and deliberate. Each stitch feels like a small act of continuity. Systems may shift, rulers may change, but the wind still blows across these hills, and sheep still grow fleece. The evening deepens, shadows pooling in corners. Outside, rain begins again soft at first, then steadier. The sound against turf is muffled, almost soothing. Trade policies may complicate livelihoods, but the essential equation remains unchanged. Grass to sheep, sheep to wool, wool to warmth. And as the wind presses gently against the sod roof, you realize that even under royal monopolies and distant oversight, the true rhythm of the Faroe Islands continues to be written in fleece and weather. The rain lingers for days this time. Not dramatic, just persistent and uninvited guest who refuses to take a hint. The hills blur into soft watercolor washes of green and gray. You wake to mist pressed against the small window opening, and the air inside the turf house feels heavier, cooler. It's the kind of weather that makes you instinctively reach for the thickest sweater available. You've stepped quietly into a colder chapter of history now, from roughly the 14th to the mid-19th century. Much of the North Atlantic experiences what climatologists later call the Little Ice Age period, marked by cooler temperatures and more volatile weather patterns. It isn't an ice age in the dramatic mammoth wandering sense, but it brings shorter growing seasons, harsher winters, and increased unpredictability. For isolated island communities like the Faroes, those shifts matter. Mainstream historians and climate scientists agree that the Little Ice Age affects agriculture across Europe. In the Faroe Islands, where arable land is already limited and heavily dependent on grass for grazing, colder, wetter conditions strain both sheep and humans. A poor summer can mean insufficient hay stored for winter fodder. Insufficient fodder means weakened flocks, and weakened flocks mean less wool and less food. You step outside between showers, boots sinking slightly into saturated turf. Sheep graze cautiously, their breath visible in the cool air, even though it's not yet winter. You notice how closely the villagers monitor the animals now. Every fluctuation in weight, every sign of illness carries weighty implications. Historians still argue about the precise severity of Little Ice Age impacts in the Faroes compared to Iceland or mainland Scandinavia. Some records suggest periods of significant hardship, including livestock losses and occasional famine conditions. Other scholars propose that the North Atlantic current moderated extremes, somewhat preventing the worst scenarios seen elsewhere. As always, the truth seems layered hard years, punctuated by slightly less hard ones. Inside the house, wool takes on even greater importance. Thick garments are not just comfort, they're defense. You pull on a heavy sweater, feeling its density settle around your shoulders like a quiet promise. The lanolin-rich fibers repel moisture from constant drizzle. Layer upon layer traps precious warmth. A quirky local belief surfaces during one particularly long storm. Some villagers once claimed that if sheep grew unusually thick fleeces early in the season, it signaled a brutal winter ahead. Whether this observation holds scientific merit is debatable, but it reflects close attention to animal behavior. When you live this intimately with your flock, you read them like living barometers. Food stores become a constant topic of conversation. Dried fish hang from rafters. Barrels of preserved meat are checked and rechecked. Wool, though not edible, becomes tradable security. A well-knit garment can be exchanged for grain if supply ships manage to reach the islands between storms. You sit by the hearth as wind lashes outside, rattling the door with renewed determination. The turf roof absorbs the worst of it, grass bending low under gusts. Smoke curls upward sluggishly, sometimes pushed back down by shifting air pressure. The house feels smaller during prolonged bad weather, as if the world has shrunk to stone walls and flickering light. Children are quieter. Even their games adapt to indoor confinement. You notice more mending happening, old sweaters reinforced at elbows, cuffs reknit where fibers have thinned. Nothing is wasted. A garment may be unraveled entirely if to worn, the yarn repurposed into something smaller. Recycling isn't a trend, it's survival. There are stories of particularly grim winters when snow lingers longer than usual, when grazing becomes scarce and sheep must be culled to preserve the strongest. Those decisions are never easy. Each animal represents investment, future fleece, future lambs. But limited fodder forces harsh calculations. The sea, too, grows more temperamental during certain decades. Storm frequency appears to increase in some accounts, though historians debate whether records simply become more detailed over time. Fishing boats risk greater danger. Trade shipments face longer delays. Isolation deepens. You feel the weight of that isolation one evening as wind howls with unusual intensity, a low, almost mournful sound across the cliffs. It presses against the house relentlessly. You tighten your sweater instinctively, as if fabric alone can reassure you that walls will hold. And yet, life continues. Sheep still lamb in spring. Wool is still sheared, spun, dyed, knit. Patterns may shift slightly, perhaps thicker yarn favored during colder decades, but the essential cycle remains intact. Resilience here is not flashy. It's quiet repetition. You step outside after one storm finally breaks. The sky clears in ragged patches, revealing a pale strip of blue. Sunlight glances off wet grass, turning the hills momentarily luminous. Sheep emerge from shelter, shaking themselves briskly. The ocean still churns, but less violently. In that fragile calm, you sense something profound: adaptation. The little ice age may press harder, seasons may fluctuate unpredictably, but the villagers respond not with grand declarations, but with incremental adjustments. Store a little more hay, knit a little thicker, mend instead of discard. Weather shapes wool, and wool answers weather. As evening settles once more, you return to your seat by the hearth, needles in hand. The pattern grows beneath your fingers, steady and unhurried. Outside, clouds drift across the moon. The Atlantic breathes in long, patient rhythms. Even in colder centuries, even when harvests falter and winds sharpen. The thread continues: grass to sheep, sheep to fleece, fleece to yarn, yarn to warmth. And in that continuity, you find a kind of enduring comfort that no storm can fully unravel. The storm has passed, but Sunday arrives with its own kind of hush. The wind still moves across the hills, yet the village feels deliberately quieter, as if even the sheep have agreed to lower their voices out of respect. You pull on your thick sweater, the one that has slowly grown beneath your hands, and step toward the small wooden church, nestled low against the landscape. Christianity has shaped life in the Faroe Islands since the conversion period around the year 1000, when Norse territories gradually adopted the new faith. According to Icelandic sagas, Sigmundur Brestison played a key role in introducing Christianity to the Faroes, though the saga accounts are dramatic and not entirely free from embellishment. Mainstream historians accept that by the early 11th century, Christianity was firmly established here, woven into the rhythms of daily life. The church itself is modest, built to endure wind more than impress visitors. Its walls are sturdy, roof angled low. Inside, the air smells faintly of damp wood and wool. Everyone wears their best garments, often hand-knit, carefully maintained. Sunday is not a fashion show, but there is quiet pride in appearing well turned out. A neatly knit sweater becomes both offering and testimony. You sit on a simple bench, the fabric of your sleeve brushing against rough wood. Sermons here do not drift far from practical concerns. Faith intertwines with weather, with harvests, with safe returns from sea. When storms rage for days, prayers rise accordingly. When lambing season goes smoothly, gratitude follows. Historians still argue about how deeply pre-Christian beliefs persisted beneath the surface of official doctrine. Folklore about hidden people, sea spirits and omens continues long after church authority is established. In small communities, old stories do not vanish overnight. They adapt, coexist. A prayer may be whispered before shearing, and an old charm remembered quietly when wind howls unusually hard. Wool even finds a subtle place in religious life. In colder centuries, churches rely on heavy textiles blankets, shawls, to keep congregants warm during long services. The building itself offers little insulation beyond thick walls. Without wool, winter worship would be a brief and shivering affair. You notice how women's hands rarely remain idle, even on a Sabbath. While formal spinning or knitting might pause during the service itself, mending and quiet textile work resume afterward. There are debates, of course, about what constitutes appropriate labor on holy days. Some elders frown at visible work. Others argue that tending to essential clothing is no different than tending to animals, necessary, not indulgent. A quirky belief lingers in conversation outside the church. It was once said that if you spun yarn on certain major feast days, the thread would tangle endlessly, as if divine disapproval had physically manifested in knots. Whether this was theological doctrine or simply a clever way to guarantee a rare day of rest remains delightfully unclear. After the service, villagers gather in small clusters. News is exchanged. Sheep health discussed. Whether predictions debated with the seriousness of royal councils, the churchyard becomes a social hub, reinforcing bonds that stretch beyond faith into everyday cooperation. You glance up at the sky, clouds move quickly, light shifting across the hills in pale flashes. Even here, standing in what is meant to be sacred space, you feel the constant presence of wind. It's almost theological in its own way and scene, yet undeniable. The relationship between church authority and everyday wool production isn't always perfectly harmonious. In certain periods, especially after the Lutheran Reformation in the 16th century, when Denmark officially adopted Lutheranism and imposed it across its territories, church structures and expectations shift. Clergy may attempt to regulate aspects of life more closely, yet wool remains stubbornly practical. No sermon can argue away the need for warmth. Mainstream historical records confirm that the Reformation reached the Faroe Islands in the 1530s, aligning religious practice with Danish governance. The church becomes more centralized under Danish oversight, just as trade does. For villagers, this means changes in liturgy and leadership, but the wind outside sounds exactly the same. You walk home slowly after the gathering disperses. Sheep dot the hillside, grazing peacefully. A few children race ahead, scarves trailing. The air carries that crisp clarity that follows rain. Inside the turf house once more, the hearth is rekindled. Sunday dinner is modest but warm. You remove your sweater briefly, examining its pattern in the firelight. Each stitch holds not only labor, but shared belief in community, in cycles, in endurance. There is comfort in repetition. Church each week, shearing each spring, spinning each evening, storms each season. Wool binds these rhythms together, as constant as prayer. As dusk settles, you sit quietly, listening to the low murmur of wind along the roof. The village feels held in a delicate balance between earth and sky, between old stories and new doctrines. And in that balance, beneath sod and smoke, faith and fleece continue to coexist threads in the same enduring fabric of island life. The quiet of Sunday fades into the steady hum of weekday life, and you begin to notice something subtle but unmistakable. While the wind may dominate the hills and the sea may command the men's attention, it is the steady movement of women's hands that quietly shapes the village's wealth. You sit again by the hearth, this time not as an observer but as a participant in a small, unspoken economy. Around you, women spin, knit, mend, and calculate. Not with ledgers, though some can manage those too, but with memory. They know how many skeins remain from last shearing. They know which neighbor owes a favor. They know which family's sheep suffered during the last harsh winter and may need extra wool in trade. Mainstream historians studying Nordic rural societies have increasingly emphasized the economic power embedded in textile production. In the Faroe Islands, where large-scale agriculture is limited, wool is not merely domestic craft, it is currency. Women oversee much of its transformation from raw fleece to finished goods. That transformation carries value. You watch as a woman measures yarn against her forearm, estimating length with remarkable accuracy. No ruler, no calculator, just embodied knowledge. Her sweater patterns are precise, her tension even. When she finishes a garment, it is not just clothing, it is a negotiable asset. Historians still argue whether Faroese women in earlier centuries exercised formal economic authority or whether their influence remained largely informal but deeply embedded in household management. Written records often center on male landowners and official transactions, but material culture garments, tools. Surviving pattern tells a quieter story of sustained female labor and decision. Outside, the wind rises again, combing through the grass. Sheep graze, unaware that their fleece underpins a network of exchange largely orchestrated indoors. You begin to see how marriage negotiations, for example, are not solely about land or livestock counts. A bride known for exceptional knitting skill brings tangible value into a household. Her ability to produce durable, desirable garments strengthens trade prospects. It's not romantic poetry, perhaps, but it's practical admiration. A quirky anecdote surfaces from conversation. In some villages, it was joked half-seriously that a woman who could knit evenly during a fierce windstorm would surely manage any domestic crisis. Wind as character test. You imagine conducting job interviews during a gale. Please demonstrate your pearl stitch while the door tries to escape. As fishing seasons pull many men out to sea for extended periods, the domestic sphere becomes even more central. Women manage stores, oversee livestock care, and continue textile production. Wool output does not pause simply because boats have departed. You notice how knowledge flows across generations. A grandmother corrects a child's spinning technique with a gentle adjustment of fingers. A mother explains why certain wool is reserved for heavier outer garments, while softer undercoat fibers are spun finer for inner layers. These decisions affect comfort, durability, and trade value. Weather intrudes, as always. A prolonged damp spell can slow drying times for fleece or dyed yarn. Women adapt, rearranging tasks, perhaps focusing on knitting previously prepared yarn while waiting for clearer skies to process new fleece. Flexibility becomes a quiet skill. In households where sheep numbers are modest, careful management of wool stock is essential. A miscalculation could mean insufficient garments for winter or fewer goods available for trade. You sense the mental arithmetic constantly ticking beneath casual conversation. Mainstream economic historians have noted that, in many pre-industrial societies, textile production often represents one of the few forms of exportable surplus that households can generate. The Faroe Islands exemplify this pattern. Even under Danish trade monopolies, much of the practical labor that supports export quotas originates here by the hearth. You glance at your own growing sweater. Each stitch feels slightly heavier now, weighted with awareness. You are not simply crafting warmth. You are participating in an economic web that stretches beyond the village, across cold waters to distant markets. A discussion arises about setting aside certain particularly fine skeins. For later, someone says vaguely, later might mean a wedding gift. Later might mean a lean year. Later might mean discreet exchange outside official channels. Wool can be hidden, stored, revealed when needed. Historians still debate how much informal barter persisted alongside official monopoly trade. In tight-knit communities, unofficial exchanges are almost inevitable. A sweater traded for extra peat, yarn exchanged for help repairing a roof. These microtransactions rarely leave written records, but they leave traces in memory and material culture. The hearth crackles steadily. Needles click in unison. Outside, clouds drift low, occasionally breaking to reveal thin shafts of sunlight. Sheep move like pale punctuation marks across the hillside. You realize that authority here is not loud. It does not arrive with proclamations. It sits quietly, spinning by firelight, deciding which wool becomes a sweater and which remains stored for uncertain days. As evening deepens, you help wind finished yarn into tight balls, ready for the next garment. The motion is simple, circular, almost meditative. Circle within circle-like seasons, like trade cycles, like the steady return of wind. In this village, power is layered like wool fibers, outer strength visible, inner softness less obvious but equally essential. And beneath the sod roof, amid smoke and shifting weather, women's hands continue their quiet, decisive work, threading resilience into every stitch. Dawn arrives with a sharper edge today. The wind has swung north, carrying a chill that slices through the village lanes and skims whitecaps across the fjord. You stand near the harbor again, your sweater pulled snug, watching men prepare their boats for a fishing run. If wool is the village's quiet heartbeat, the sea is its restless pulse. For centuries, Faroe's men have ventured into surrounding waters for cod, haddock, and other North Atlantic fish. By the 18th, and especially the 19th century, fishing grows steadily in economic importance, eventually overtaking agriculture as the island's primary industry. But long before industrial trawlers, there are small wooden boats and thick wool garments. Mainstream historians confirm that open rowing boats softened were the backbone of early Faroese fishing. These boats, light enough to haul ashore, yet sturdy enough to handle unpredictable swells, required coordination and nerve. You watch as oars are checked, lines coiled, hooks inspected. The sky is layered with moving gray, offering no guarantees. The men wear heavy knit sweaters, dense and patterned, often layered beneath oilskins. Wool is essential here. Its natural lanolin repels water, and even when damp, wool retains warmth, unlike many modern fabrics that surrender dramatically at the first hint of moisture. If you've ever worn a cotton hoodie in cold rain, you know the betrayal. Wool, by contrast, remains loyal. Historians still argue about how much fishing techniques in the Faroes evolved independently versus being influenced by neighboring regions like Shetland, Iceland, and coastal Norway. Given the steady trickle of trade and shared North Atlantic conditions, cross-pollination of methods seems inevitable. But local adaptation is equally undeniable. Every stretch of water has its own temperament. You step closer as one man adjusts the collar of his sweater, tugging it higher against his neck. The pattern across his chest mirrors ones you've seen by the hearth, geometric, rhythmic, understated. It's almost poetic. The same hands that spin and knit inside turf houses create the armor these men wear into open water. A quirky old saying drifts through the group: trust your wool more than the weather. It's delivered half in jest, but there's truth in it. Forecasting here relies on observation, cloud shape, wind direction, the behavior of seabirds, yet the Atlantic has a talent for surprise. The boats push off, oars dipping in unison. You remain on shore, watching until they clear the harbor's shelter. The wind tugs at your own sweater, reminding you that warmth on land is one thing, warmth at sea is another. Fishing trips can last hours or days, depending on distance and luck. In earlier centuries, preservation methods, drying, salting, are crucial. Fish, once caught, must be processed quickly. Stockfish becomes a key export, especially under Danish trade systems. But without reliable clothing, none of that matters. Exposure is the constant threat. You imagine the scene offshore, men hauling lines with numb fingers, spray freezing in colder months, decks slick with seawater. Wool fibers swell slightly when wet, tightening their weave and reducing airflow. It's a small but meaningful defense against wind chill. Back in the village, women continue their work. Spinning wheels turn, needles click. The connection between shore and sea feels almost tangible. Each stitch cast on by the hearth may protect someone balancing on a rocking deck. Weather shifts again by midday. Clouds thicken, wind rising in uneven gusts. You find yourself scanning the horizon, measuring distance by instinct rather than calculation. The ocean darkens, reflecting the sky's mood. There are stories, some documented, others passed quietly, of sudden squalls that overturned boats, of men lost to waves that showed no mercy. Faroe's maritime history includes its share of tragedy. Yet fishing persists because it must. The sea feeds the village. Wool shields those who harvest its bounty. Historians debate the precise mortality rates of early Faroese fishermen. Records are incomplete. But oral tradition preserves the emotional truth. Departures are never entirely casual. Each launch carries a silent hope for safe return. You pace along the rocky shore, The wind's stronger now. Sheep graze above you on the cliffs, indifferent to the drama below. The juxtaposition feels almost surreal pastoral calm above maritime risk below. As afternoon leans toward evening, dark shapes appear against the horizon. Boats returning, you exhale, realizing you've been holding your breath. The oars move steadily, the hulls cutting through choppy water. When the boats reach harbor, the men disembark with quiet efficiency. Catches are modest but sufficient. Sweaters are damp but intact. No one makes grand speeches. Relief is understated. You help carry baskets of fish toward drying racks. The air smells briny and metallic. Wool sleeves brush against rough rope and wooden planks, absorbing faint traces of salt. Inside that evening by the hearth once more, stories of shifting currents and sudden gusts fill the room. Sweaters hang near the fire to dry, steam rising faintly. You notice how the patterns look darker when wet, colors deepening like storm clouds. The wind continues outside, restless but less menacing now. You pick up your knitting again, adding another row to the growing garment in your lap. Sea and sheep, wind and wool, shore and boat. The rhythms overlap, each dependent on the other, and as night settles over the fjord, you understand that every sweater here carries more than warmth. It carries the quiet courage of those who step into cold water, trusting that the fabric against their skin will hold fast against the Atlantic's endless breath. By late autumn, the light begins to thin, as if someone has gently lowered the dimmer switch on the sky. You wake to mornings that hover in a bluish half-darkness, and evenings that arrive almost before you've finished your midday tasks. The Faroe Islands sit far north in the Atlantic, and while they do not reach the extreme polar night of more Arctic latitudes, winter daylight can shrink to just a handful of hours. Mainstream climatological records confirm that in midwinter, the Faroes receive roughly 5 hours of true daylight. The sun rises reluctantly, arcs low across the southern horizon, and slips away before you've properly warmed your hands. It never climbs high, shadows stretch long and soft. You step outside into a wind that feels sharper now, less playful and more insistent. The hills are muted greens and browns, sheep clustered in small groups, as if conserving shared warmth. Turf roofs appear darker under frequent rain, and the air smells faintly of damp earth and distant salt. Inside, life contracts inward. The hearth becomes not merely a convenience, but the center of gravity. Work shifts accordingly. Spinning, knitting, mending, repairing tools, these tasks suit limited light. You learn to value every minute of brightness, arranging chores that require outdoor movement within that narrow window. Historians still argue whether seasonal affective patterns significantly shaped social structures in North Atlantic communities, or whether practical necessity overshadowed psychological impact. Written records from earlier centuries rarely discuss mood explicitly, but the rhythms of labor tell their own story. Productivity adjusts to light. Candles and oil lamps flicker in the dim interior. Their glow softens edges, casting shadows that move with the wind's pressure on walls. You become acutely aware of how weather dictates routine. A stormy morning might delay sheep checks. A brief patch of calm becomes an opportunity seized immediately. A quirky local belief drifts into conversation. Some say that if you listen carefully on the darkest nights, you can hear the wind carrying voices from other islands. It's likely just imagination, amplified by isolation and gusting air currents around cliffs. Still, you find yourself pausing, head tilted, as the wind hums along the eaves. If it starts reciting grocery lists, you'll know you've been indoors too long. Diet shifts as well. Fresh greens are scarce. Preserved foods take precedence. Dried fish from autumn catches, salted meat, stored root vegetables. The body craves calories. Wool layers thicken accordingly. You help fetch peat blocks stacked earlier in the year. Their earthy scent intensifies as they burn, releasing slow, steady heat. Smoke threads upward, escaping through roof vents. The interior air feels heavy but comforting. Mainstream historical data show that winter storms in the North Atlantic are driven by powerful low-pressure systems, bringing frequent gales and heavy precipitation. In the Faroes, this translates to relentless wind and rain rather than deep, lasting snow. Snow does fall, but it often melts quickly under maritime conditions. Historians debate whether communities here experienced harsher winters during the Little Ice Age compared to mainland Scandinavia. Proxy climate data suggest fluctuations, but precise local impacts remain difficult to quantify. Oral tradition, however, preserves tales of particularly bitter season's sheep. Lost supplies, stretched thin. You notice how sheep are brought closer to shelter during the worst weather. Stone walls offer partial protection, and careful grazing management prevents overuse of exposed slopes. Wool thickens naturally in colder months, providing insulation to the animals themselves. Nature's own layering system. Children adapt quickly to the dimness. Games shift indoors. Storytelling grows more elaborate. The boundaries between folklore and history blur in the low light. You listen to tales of sea spirits and hidden folk dwelling in hills. Stories shaped by long nights and wind that seems to breathe. The wind rattles, shudders, then eases, then returns in uneven pulses. You've begun to recognize its tones, high whistling gusts through narrow gaps, low moans along turf edges. It's like learning the personality of a very loud roommate who refuses to move out. Your knitting progresses steadily. Winter is prime production time. With outdoor tasks, reduced textiles flourish. Sweaters grow denser, mittens multiply, socks stack in neat piles. Each finished item becomes both shield and reassurance. You step briefly outside near midday, when the sun is highest, though highest is generous. It hangs low, pale and distant. The sea reflects a silvery sheen, waves rolling under a sky that never fully brightens. You inhale deeply. The air is crisp, edged with salt. There's a quiet beauty in this restraint of light. Colors soften, sounds carry differently. The village feels smaller, more intimate. Smoke rises from multiple roofs, drifting sideways in the wind. Back inside, conversation drifts toward preparations for midwinter gatherings. Even in lean times, communal moments persist. Shared meals, shared songs, shared warmth. Darkness encourages closeness. Historians still argue whether such winter gatherings served primarily social bonding functions or reinforced economic cooperation networks. Perhaps both. In small communities, emotional and practical survival intertwine. As evening settles, though, it hardly feels different from late afternoon. You sit again by the hearth. The fire crackles softly, peat glowing red beneath flame. Your hands move automatically now, knitting in rhythm with breath. Outside, wind sweeps across hills and cliffs, meeting no resistance but stone and wool. Inside, you settle deeper into the layered warmth of fabric and fire, accepting that for a few months each year. The world narrows to this circle of light, and that within that circle, life continues, steady and unbroken. Winter does not arrive with a single dramatic entrance. It settles in gradually, like an uninvited guest who politely removes their shoes but refuses to leave. You wake one morning to find the wind carrying sleet that stings your cheeks and dots your wool sleeves with tiny beads of ice. The hills above the village wear a faint whitening, not a deep snowpack, but a thin crust that clings to grass and stone. The Faroe Islands rarely experience prolonged heavy snowfall due to their maritime climate. Moderated by the North Atlantic current, mainstream climate science confirms that oceanic influence keeps average winter temperatures relatively mild for the latitude often hovering just above freezing. It sounds gentle on paper. In practice, it means relentless, damp cold, the kind that seeps into boots and lingers. You pull your sweater tighter and step carefully along the slick path. Stone underfoot glistens, and every surface feels slightly treacherous. Sheep cluster closer to low walls, their thick fleeces now visibly heavier. Wool fibers trap air, providing insulation even when moisture clings to the outer layer. It's the same principle protecting you. Inside, preparation intensifies. Peat stacks are checked, rearranged, guarded like treasure. Dried fish stores are inspected for spoilage. You learn quickly that winter here is less about dramatic blizzards and more about endurance-steady resource management, careful pacing. Historians still argue whether Faroe's winter survival strategies evolved primarily through Norse inheritance or adapted uniquely to the island's particular blend of wind, rain, and limited arable land. Archaeological findings show continuity with broader North Atlantic practices. Yet the specific balance of sheep farming and fishing reflects local necessity. You help reinforce a section of turf roofing, pressing sod back into place where wind has prided edges. Turf houses common for centuries across the North Atlantic provide remarkable insulation. Layers of earth over wooden frames buffer against wind chill. It's not glamorous architecture, but it's practical. Think eco-friendly before eco-friendly was a marketing strategy. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you work. Some villagers claim that particularly fierce winter winds can comb the sheep as fleece in one direction, making it easier to shear evenly come spring. Whether meteorology doubles as stylist, you're not entirely convinced. The sheep look perpetually tousled. Storms arrive in pulses. One afternoon, clouds thicken so quickly that daylight dims within minutes. Rain turns to sleet, sleet to heavy wet snow, then back again. You hear the wind rise, pressing against walls, probing for weakness. Mainstream meteorology explains these rapid shifts as the result of fast-moving low-pressure systems sweeping across the North Atlantic. Temperature gradients collide. Precipitation changes form mid-storm. For villagers, the scientific explanation matters less than the practical outcome. Secure everything. Use secure tools, double-check shutters, bring in anything light enough to be claimed by gusts. Wool garments hang closer to the fire, drying between bouts of outdoor exposure. Fishing becomes riskier now. Smaller boats venture out only during calmer windows. Some days, the sea is too volatile. You watch from shore as waves crash against dark rocks, sending spray high into the air. It's a reminder that winter reshapes priorities. Survival outweighs profit. Historians debate how often winter storms in earlier centuries resulted in significant loss of life compared to modern times. When improved, forecasting and sturdier vessels reduce risk. Records suggest tragedy was not uncommon, though communities developed keen observational skills to minimize danger. Inside, you sit near the hearth and mend a mitten worn thin at the thumb. The repetitive motion steadies your thoughts. Outside, the wind howls briefly, then settles into a lower hum. Food preparation feels more deliberate now. Thick fish soups simmer slowly. Barley porridge warms steadily. You appreciate the simple chemistry of heat and sustenance. Calories are currency in winter. Children venture outside only briefly, bundled in layers of wool. Their laughter cuts through the wind before being carried off. You notice how quickly they retreat indoors when fingers begin to numb. A fringe belief emerges in quiet conversation. Some elders once read winter severity by observing sheep behavior in autumn. If sheep grazed lower slopes earlier than usual, harsher weather was expected. Modern science might label it anecdotal, yet animal behavior can reflect subtle environmental cues. Historians still argue whether such folk forecasting held consistent accuracy or merely offered comfort in uncertainty. You step outside again at dusk. Snow flurries drift sideways, illuminated faintly by fading light. The sea beyond the harbor looks darker. Returning inside, you peel off damp outer layers, hanging them carefully. Steam rises gently as wool dries, releasing a faint lanolin scent. There's no dramatic climax to winter's arrival, just a steady tightening of routines, a sharpening of attention. You become more deliberate in movement, more conscious of stores, more grateful for each warm meal. As night settles fully, you resume knitting by lamplight. The wind brushes against the walls, less aggressive now, almost conversational. Winter has taken its seat at the table, and you, wrapped in wool and peat-warmed air, settle in too prepared not for spectacle, but for endurance, one careful day at a time. Somewhere in the long stretch of winter evenings, when the wind softens to a low murmur and the peat fire glows more than it flames, stories begin to take on a life of their own. You sit close to the hearth, knitting resting in your lap for once, listening as voices lower and stretch, weaving tales as intricate as any sweater pattern. In the Faroe Islands, folklore has long been a central thread of cultural life. Mainstream scholars recognize the rich oral tradition preserved in ballads and legends, many of which were later collected in the 19th century by figures like V.U. Hammershaimb, who helped standardize the Faroese written language. Before ink and paper fixed these stories, they lived entirely in memory carried. Through winters much like this one, the wind outside provides perfect accompaniment. It slides along the turf roof and whistles faintly through gaps, as if trying to listen in. You pull your wool shawl tighter, the fibers warm and faintly scented with smoke. Tonight, someone recounts the tale of the Huldufólk, the hidden people said to dwell within hills and rocky outcrops. According to tradition, these beings live lives parallel to human villagers, tending their own livestock, celebrating their own feasts. It's considered wise not to disturb certain mounds or boulders, just in case you're disrupting someone else's invisible household. Historians still argue whether such beliefs primarily functioned as moral frameworks encouraging respect for landscape and property or weather, They reflect deeper pre-Christian cosmologies carried from Norse settlement. Either way, the stories persist, especially when darkness presses close. You glance toward the hillside beyond the small window. In the dim light, every rounded knoll looks faintly suggestive, as though it might conceal a doorway if you knew how to knock properly. You make a mental note not to redecorate any hills without permission. Another tale surfaces of Selkie seal creatures that shed their skins to become human on land. The North Atlantic, with its ever-present seals along rocky shores, provides fertile ground for such myths. Mainstream folklorists classify Selkie stories across Scottish, Icelandic, and Faroese traditions, noting shared motifs, stolen skins, longing for the sea, divided loyalties. The sea, after all, is both provider and threat. It makes sense that imagination would populate it with beings caught between worlds. The fire shifts, sending sparks upward. Shadows dance across the low ceiling. You notice how storytelling fills winter's constrained hours with expansive possibility. Where daylight is limited, narrative stretches. A quirky tidbit slips into the conversation. Some older Faroes believed that knitting certain patterns could subtly ward off malevolent forces. While there's no historical record of officially protective sweater designs, the idea of symbolic motifs woven into fabric isn't unique. Across many cultures, textiles carry meaning beyond mere function. You glance down at your own knitting, suddenly wondering if you've accidentally included a rune for mild inconvenience. If tomorrow's tea tastes odd, you'll know why. The ballads begin next feedy, traditional Faroese chain dance songs. Though more commonly performed at gatherings and festivals, fragments echo even in small winter rooms. Their repetitive rhythmic verses recount heroic sagas and historical events, some tracing back to medieval Norse narratives. Mainstream historians acknowledge that these ballads preserved elements of medieval Scandinavian literature long after written manuscripts faded elsewhere. Oral transmission here acted as cultural archive. It's remarkable, really human memory functioning like a living library. Historians still debate how accurately these ballads reflect historical events versus creative embellishment layered over generations. The line between chronicle and artistry blurs easily when sung across centuries. Outside, the wind rises briefly, rattling the door latch before subsiding. You feel oddly comforted by its persistence. It's like a percussion section to the evening's storytelling. Someone describes an old belief that particularly fierce gusts are caused by unseen beings racing across the cliffs. Meteorology would credit pressure gradients and terrain effects. Folklore prefers more animated explanations. Honestly, imagining invisible racers feels more entertaining than reciting barometric data. The room grows warmer as more peat is added to the fire. Wool sleeves brush together as people shift closer. You sense how these shared stories reinforce community bonds. Everyone knows the same hills, the same rocks, the same treacherous currents. Legends attach meaning to familiar terrain. You think about how wool itself participates in this tradition. Patterns passed down through generations may not encode explicit myths, but they carry continuity. A design learned from a grandmother becomes a tangible link to her voice, her stories. The evening deepens. Lamps flicker lower. Outside, the sky is a thick, seamless dark. Before dispersing, someone offers a final reminder. Treat the land kindly, respect the sea, and don't mock what you don't understand. It's practical advice wrapped in folklore's clothing. You rise, stretching slightly, joints warmed by fire and proximity. The wind hums again, softer now. As you settle back near the hearth, knitting resumed, you realize that winter here is not merely endured, it is filled with stories, songs, patterns, and the steady reassurance that even in darkness, voices continue weaving meaning into the long Faroese night. In the middle of the North Atlantic, suspended between Iceland and Norway, lies a remote archipelago of 18 volcanic islands. This is the Faroe Islands, a place where jagged cliffs plunge into the churning sea, and green, treeless hills are dotted with more sheep than people. In fact, the name Faroe, the Faroe Islands, is thought to mean sheep islands, and for centuries, these hardy animals have been the lifeblood of this unique and resilient culture. As the long, harsh winter finally loosens its grip, a palpable sense of anticipation fills the air. The days grow longer, and the first hints of spring breathe life back into the dramatic landscapes. For the Faroese farmers, this is a pivotal time of year. The sheep, having weathered the brutal Atlantic gales with their thick, shaggy fleeces, are about to begin their annual journey from the mountains back to the lowlands. It's a tradition as old as the islands themselves, a rhythm of life dictated by the seasons. The Faroe sheep is a breed unlike any other. They are descendants of animals brought by the first Viking settlers over 1,000 years ago. Small, nimble, and incredibly resilient. They've adapted perfectly to this challenging environment. For most of the year, they roam free, grazing on the lush, windswept grasses, their presence a constant living thread in the fabric of Faroe's life. You'll see them everywhere, perched on steep hillsides, wandering along coastal paths, and even occasionally causing a traffic jam on the narrow roads. They are the true inhabitants of these islands. This period of transition, from late spring into early summer, is crucial. The EUs are heavy with lambs, and bringing them down from the remote, inaccessible mountain pastures is a communal effort. It's an event called a heimari, which translates to home riding, though today it's done on foot. Entire communities come together. Farmers, families, and friends form long lines, spread out across the mountains, and with whistles, shouts, and the help of skilled sheepdogs, they gently guide the flocks downward. It's a breathtaking spectacle of coordination and tradition. A human and animal ballet played out against a stunning natural backdrop. Once the sheep are gathered in the pens, a process known as retear, the real work begins. The lambs are born and the flock is sorted. It's a time of intense activity and celebration. The air buzzes with the bleating of sheep and the cheerful chatter of the farmers. For them, this isn't just a job, it's a legacy passed down through generations. Each sheep tells a story, and each farmer knows their flock intimately. And then comes the main event, shearing. Traditionally, this happens once a year, in early summer. The heavy winter wool, which has protected the sheep from snow and freezing rain, is now ready to be harvested. Shearing in the Faroe Islands is still done by hand, using traditional shears. It's a skill that requires precision, strength, and a gentle touch. The goal is to remove the fleece in one single continuous piece, like peeling an apple. Watching an experienced Faroese farmer at work is mesmerizing. It's a dance of respect between human and animal. The wool they harvest is extraordinary. It's rich in lanolin, a natural oil that makes it water-resistant and incredibly warm. For centuries, this wool was the island's most valuable commodity. Often called Faroese gold, it clothed the islanders, provided a vital source of income, and became a cornerstone of their identity. The story of the wool doesn't end with the shearing. It's just the beginning of another fascinating process. The raw fleece is carefully sorted and cleaned. Then it's carded, a process that untangles the fibers and prepares them for spinning. Traditionally, women would gather during the long winter nights for what was known as a kveldsseta. They would spin wool, knit, tell stories, and sing ancient Faroese ballads. It was a time of community, creativity, and cultural preservation. This tradition lives on today. While modern technology has arrived, the art of hand spinning and hand knitting remains deeply cherished. The iconic Faroese sweater, or furoisketroye, is more than just a piece of clothing. Its intricate patterns, often inspired by nature, tell stories of the sea, the mountains, and the lives of the people. Each sweater is a wearable piece of art, a symbol of Faroese resilience and craftsmanship. Local brands and designers are now taking this heritage and reinterpreting it for a modern audience. They are creating stunning contemporary fashion while staying true to the principles of sustainability and local production. The wool, once a necessity for survival, is now a source of creative expression and economic innovation, connecting the island's past with its future. Companies like Garun and Garun gained international fame when one of their hand-knit sweaters was featured in a popular television series. Shining a global spotlight on this small island's big textile traditions, but sheep farming in the Faroe Islands is about more than just wool. It's also about food. The Faroes have a unique method of preserving meat called rikst, a process of wind-drying and fermentation that gives the meat a distinct, strong flavor. Lamb is a staple of the local cuisine, and dishes like scarepike jut, wind-dried mutton, are considered national delicacies. It's a taste that is deeply connected to the land and the climate. A culinary tradition born from the need to preserve food through the long winters. As summer fades and autumn paints the hills in shades of gold and brown, the cycle begins anew. The sheep are once again guided back up into the mountains to roam free for another year. It's a poignant moment. a letting go that symbolizes the deep trust and symbiotic relationship between the Faroe people and their flocks. Living in the Faroe Islands means living in harmony with nature's powerful rhythms. It means understanding that survival and prosperity are tied to the well-being of the land and its creatures. The sheep are more than just livestock here. They are partners. They have shaped the landscape, the economy, the culture, and the very character of the Faroe people. They are a living, breathing symbol of endurance, community, and a heritage that is woven into every fiber of these magical islands, from the dramatic mountain roundups to the quiet intimacy of a knitting circle. The story of the Faroe sheep is a story of connection. It's a connection to the past, a connection to the community, and a profound connection to the wild, beautiful, and unforgiving nature of the North Atlantic. And it's a story that continues to unfold, one season, one sheep, and one stitch at a time. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey to the Sheep Islands. If you found this story as fascinating as we do, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more adventures, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. See you next time. When shearing day finally arrives, it does not trumpet its importance with fanfare. The wind is moderate, mercifully so, and the sky holds a steady gray that threatens rain, but keeps its distance for now. You step into the enclosure with a mixture of anticipation and mild concern for your back muscles. Sheep, as it turns out, are not small decorative cushions. Shearing in the Faroe Islands has long been both practical necessity and communal event. Mainstream agricultural records show that traditional hand shearing with large metal blades persisted well into the 20th century, even after mechanized clippers became available elsewhere. On islands where electricity once arrived unevenly, muscle and skill remained reliable tools. You watch as an experienced shearer settles a sheep gently but firmly, positioning it with practiced efficiency. The blades glide through dense fleece in long, controlled strokes. There's a rhythm to it: press, lift, guide, release. The sheep appears more inconvenienced than distressed, as if mildly offended by a sudden haircut appointment it did not book. Historians still argue whether communal shearing days functioned primarily as labor shearing systems or as subtle reinforcement of social hierarchy: whose sheep were shorn first, who assisted whom, who directed the process. In small villages, practical cooperation and social structure often overlap. You kneel to gather the freshly removed fleece, surprised at its weight and warmth. It comes away in a near-whole mat, if done skillfully, a single shaggy layer that only moments ago insulated a living body against Atlantic wind. Lanolin coats your fingers again, faintly sticky but protective. The dual nature of Faroese wool becomes evident as you sort. The coarse outer fibers to gill lend durability to outer garments, while the softer undercoat thell can be separated for finer yarn. This natural tulier system distinguishes North Atlantic breeds and shapes textile traditions. A quirky bit of local lore floats through the air as hands work. Some claim that talking too loudly during shearing agitates the flock for the rest of the season. Whether sheep truly hold grudges is uncertain, but you keep your commentary to a polite murmur just in case. Clouds thicken briefly, and a few drops of rain patter against your wool sleeve. Timing shearing around weather remains crucial. Wet fleece is heavier, harder to cut cleanly, and slower to dry. Mainstream farming guidance consistently emphasizes dry conditions for optimal results. Rule that becomes a gamble in these islands: you help carry sorted fleeces towards sheltered storage. Indoors, the real transformation begins. Raw fleece must be cleaned, teased apart, and prepared. In earlier centuries, washing occurred in streams or large tubs. Though excessive washing could strip too much lanolin, balance is key. Historians still debate how thoroughly Faroese wool was traditionally washed before spinning. Some evidence suggests minimal washing preserved water resistance in finished garments. Modern textile processing favors cleaner fibers, but historical practice prioritized function over aesthetic softness. You sit with others to begin teasing apart fibers by hand. The repetitive pulling and loosening feels oddly meditative. Outside, sheep now appear noticeably slimmer, their outlines sharper against the hillside. A fringe belief surfaces as someone examines a particularly dense fleece. It's said that unusually thick wool predicts a storm-heavy summer ahead, as if sheep possess meteorological foresight. Scientists would attribute fleece thickness to genetics and nutrition. But folklore rarely misses an opportunity to read prophecy into practicality. The air inside fills with a faintly sweet, earthy scent as fleeces are handled. You feel connected not only to this moment, but to centuries of identical gestures, hands separating fibers, preparing them for spinning. Children peek in wide-eyed at the transformation. The sheep they saw yesterday now look almost like different animals. You half expect them to demand tiny sweaters for the freshly shorn flock. As the day progresses, fatigue settles into shoulders and wrists. Shearing is labor-intensive, yet satisfaction accompanies each completed fleece. Material for dozens of garments now lies in soft heaps. Mainstream historians note that in pre-industrial societies, raw materials often held more visible value than finished goods because they represented potential flexibility in allocation. You understand that now. This pile of fleece could become socks, sweaters, trade goods, blankets. It is warmth in waiting. Historians still argue whether Faroe's textile output historically met solely local demand or occasionally exceeded it significantly enough to influence regional trade balances. Records hint at both subsistence focus and modest export. By late afternoon, the enclosure empties. Sheep wander back onto hillsides, adjusting to lighter bodies and cool air. The wind brushes their newly exposed coats. They look briefly surprised, then adapt. You brush stray fibers from your clothes, though a few cling stubbornly. Wool has a way of staying with you. Inside, as evening approaches, the first cleaned batches are set aside to dry properly. Spinning wheels will soon resume their steady hum, fed by this fresh supply. You glance at your hands slightly sore, faintly scented with lanolin, feel a quiet accomplishment. The cycle has turned. Winter's insulation has been harvested, spring's work set in motion. Outside, the wind continues its endless passage across hills and sea. But now, tucked inside waiting fibers, next winter's warmth already begins to take shape. With shearing done and the last of the fleece laid out to dry, my work shifts from the hillside to my hands. The journey from raw fleece to yarn begins now, a process far less glamorous than a finished sweater on a windswept cliff, but every bit as essential. I'm sitting on a low stool, a basket of clean, dry wool beside me. The first step is carding, which aligns the fibers so they can be spun smoothly. I take my hand cards, these flat paddles with fine metal teeth, and start brushing them against each other in steady, rhythmic strokes. The motion is almost hypnotic. Load the fibers, brush, lift, and roll. It's a method that has been at the heart of wool processing for centuries. Before industrial machines took over in the 18th century, every single fiber passed through human hands just like this. In remote places, this manual tradition held on much longer than it did in the big cities. After a few passes, the fibers are soft and aligned. I draw the cards apart and gently roll the wool into a loose cylinder called a rollag, which is now ready for spinning. It looks so light and airy, almost fragile, but inside it holds all the resilience shaped by the sheep, the weather, and careful, patient work. Now, I move over to the spinning wheel. Its wooden frame is worn smooth from years of use. As I start to treadle, the wheel hums to life. I take a rollag and feed it into my fingers, guiding it as it twists into yarn. It's a delicate balance. If you twist it too tight, the yarn becomes stiff and harsh. But if you twist it too loose, it'll be weak and break easily. Finding that perfect tension is key. The rhythm settles in quickly, my foot pumping the treadle, my hands guiding the fibers, and the wheel turning in a steady, calming whir. Outside, the wind whispers against the house, a faint counterpoint to the hum of the wheel. It feels like a quiet duet between nature and craft. There's a quirky old belief among spinners that you could predict the weather by how the wool felt. If the fibers were unusually full of static or resisted drafting smoothly, it was a sign a storm might be on its way. Of course, we know now that humidity definitely affects how fibers behave, but the idea of forecasting the weather through yarn gives the wool a personality all its own. As I spin, I can see the spindle slowly filling up, wrapped in even layers of fresh yarn. It's a little rough, but that's intentional. Here, garments are valued for their durability, not their silky softness. These sweaters are made for working on cliffs and fishing decks, not for walking down a fashion runway. In isolated communities like this, textile production was a huge part of life, especially during the long winter months when there was less to do on the farm. Spinning provided a steady occupation and created essential goods. Historians have noted that in some parts of Europe, women were even legally required to meet spinning quotas. There's no official quota here, but necessity is its own kind of supervisor. There is still some debate about the exact division of labor in older households, whether spinning was exclusively women, work, or if men pitched in during the off-season. While gender roles were pretty clear, survival sometimes meant that strict boundaries had to be flexible. I pause for a moment to stretch my fingers. The lanolin in the wool leaves my skin feeling surprisingly soft, though my wrists are starting to feel the strain of the constant motion. I take another rolag and feed it into the twist, resuming the steady rhythm. As the yarn accumulates, you start to notice its subtle variations. Some parts are a little thicker, others a little finer. Perfect uniformity isn't the goal. Consistent strength is what matters most. Handspun yarn always carries the unique signature of its maker, those tiny fluctuations that reveal it was made by a person, not a machine. From time to time, the kids wander in, mesmerized by the spinning blur of the wheel. One of them reaches a hand out, curious about the moving spindle, and I gently guide it away. It's a simple, almost magical transformation watching this fluff turn into thread. Outside, the sheep are grazing peacefully, completely unbothered by the fate of their old coats. The hills look a little greener now, and the light lingers just a bit longer each evening. Spring is definitely on its way. There's another fringe belief that sometimes comes up in conversation. It's said that yarn spun during a waxing moon makes for a stronger garment. While there's no scientific proof for it, the idea of timing tasks by the phases of the moon has deep roots in agricultural traditions. Once the spindle is full, I wind the finished yarn into loose loops called skeins, tying them to keep them from tangling. Soon, they'll be washed gently to set the twist and then hung up to dry. They look like pale, soft garlands hanging on the wooden racks. Textile science tells us that washing newly spun yarn helps the fibers relax and balances the tension in the twist. This stabilizes the thread and prepares it for knitting. Generations of spinners here understood this intuitively through practice, long before they had the formal scientific terms for it. Historians still discuss whether isolated communities adopted new techniques slowly because of their isolation, or if they were just being selective, choosing only the methods that suited their local materials best. What might look like resistance to change could just be practical wisdom at work. As evening sets in, I take a moment to look at the growing collection of skeins. They represent hours and hours of work carding, spinning, and steady focus. But there's a deep satisfaction in seeing raw fleece transformed into something so purposeful. The wind outside has shifted slightly. It's softer now, less urgent than the winter gales. It feels like there's a quiet harmony between the landscape and the labor. The sheep, the wind, the fiber, my hands, it's all part of one continuous cycle. I pick up one of the skeins, feeling its weight in my hand. It's a modest amount, but it's meaningful. Within its twist lies the promise of warmth against future storms, something to trade or a gift for someone special. As I stop treadling, the wheel slows to a stop. For a brief moment, there's silence before the soft murmur of the wind returns. From fleece to fiber, and from fiber to yarn, the cycle continues. And here, in my hands, the warmth for the next season is steadily spinning into being. Thank you for joining me on this part of the journey. Don't forget to follow along to see what comes next. Have you ever heard of the Faroe Islands? It's a tiny, windswept archipelago halfway between Norway and Iceland, and it holds a secret that's been kept warm for centuries. A rich, vibrant knitting tradition that's as unique as the landscape itself. Today, we're going to unravel the story of Faroe's knitting, from its practical origins to the beautiful, intricate designs that are still cherished today. So grab your own knitting project, settle in, and let's journey to the North Atlantic. The story of Faroese knitting begins with sheep. Not just any sheep, but the hardy, resilient Faroese sheep that have roamed these green hills for over 1,000 years. Their wool is incredible. It has a dual coat, a soft, insulating inner layer, and a long, glossy, water-repellent outer layer. This combination makes it perfect for the island's harsh, damp, and unpredictable weather. For centuries, this wool wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. It was the material that clothed the islanders, keeping them warm and dry, whether they were farming on a steep hillside or fishing in the cold Atlantic waters. Knitting wasn't a hobby. It was a vital part of daily life and survival. One of the most iconic pieces of Faroese knitwear is the shawl, or skipstroiga. But this isn't your typical shawl. The traditional Faroese shawl has a unique shape you won't find anywhere else. It's designed with a central back gusset and elegant shoulder shaping that makes it fit perfectly over the shoulders and stay put, even in a strong wind without needing a pin. It's a perfect example of form meeting function, a piece of clothing born directly from the needs of the people who wore it. The patterns often feature beautiful lace, but the construction is all about practicality. Now let's talk about the patterns. While other Nordic countries are famous for their bold two-color stranded knitting, Faroese knitting has its own distinct visual language. Many traditional sweaters, known as troiger, feature intricate textured patterns. Think cables, baubles, and all sorts of knit purl combinations that create a rich, three-dimensional fabric. These weren't just for decoration. The textures added extra thickness and warmth to the garment, trapping more air and providing better insulation. It's another brilliant example of how beauty and practicality are woven together in Faroese design. One of the most fascinating aspects of this tradition is the binding pattern. In the old days, when communities were more isolated, each village or even each family might have its own unique combination of these textured patterns. A sweater could tell you where a person was from just by looking at it. These patterns were passed down through generations, memorized and taught by hand, usually from mother to daughter. There were no written patterns like we have today. It was a living, breathing tradition, carried in the minds and hands of the island's knitters. This system also had a somber, practical purpose. If a fisherman was lost at sea and later found, his sweater's pattern could be used to identify him and his home village. Another key feature you'll see in Faroese sweaters is the use of natural, undyed wool. The Faroese sheep come in a beautiful range of colors: white, gray, brown, and a deep, rich black. Knitters would skillfully combine these natural shades to create subtle, stunning patterns. Imagine a sweater with a light gray body and dark brown patterns around the yoke. This reliance on natural colors gives the garments an earthy, timeless quality that connects them directly to the land and the animals they came from. Of course, they did use dyes from local plants too, creating soft yellows, greens, and browns. But the undyed wool holds a special place in the tradition. And it wasn't just sweaters and shawls. The Faroese knit everything. They made thick, warm socks, sturdy mittens, and of course, the classic fisherman's hats. Every scrap of wool was precious and used. Knitting was also a deeply social activity. In the long, dark winter evenings, people would gather for what was called a kevaldsseta. Families and neighbors would come together in one house. The women would knit, spin, or card wool, while the men might mend tools or nets. And while they worked, they would talk, sing traditional ballads, and tell stories. It was a time for community, for sharing news, and for passing on cultural knowledge. The rhythmic click-clack of knitting needles was the soundtrack to Faroese social life. So, where does this tradition stand today? Is it just a museum piece? Absolutely not. While the old ways have certainly evolved, knitting is experiencing a huge revival in the Faroe Islands and around the world. Designers like Gurun and Gurun have brought Faroese knitwear to the international stage. You might remember the iconic sweater worn by Sarah Lund in the TV series The Killing. This brought a huge amount of attention to the unique Faroese style. Today, young Faroese designers are reinterpreting the traditional patterns, playing with color and form, and creating modern garments that are still deeply rooted in their heritage. The Faroese shawl is still a popular gift for confirmations and weddings, a treasured item that connects the wearer to their cultural identity. What's truly wonderful is that this knowledge is still being passed on. Knitting is taught in schools, and there are workshops and festivals celebrating the craft. Online communities have also allowed Faroese knitters to share their skills with a global audience. You can now find patterns and buy Faroese wool online, allowing anyone, anywhere in the world, to try their hand at creating their own piece of Faroese history. It's a testament to the enduring power and beauty of this craft that it continues to thrive and inspire. It's more than just a way to make clothes. It's a thread that connects the past to the present, a tangible piece of cultural identity, and a story told in every single stitch. So next time you see a beautifully textured sweater or a uniquely shaped shawl, take a closer look. You might just be looking at a piece of Faroese tradition, a story of survival, community, and artistry. knitted into the very fabric of an island nation. It's a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things are born from necessity, and that the skills of our ancestors still have so much to teach us. I hope you found it as fascinating as I do. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more stories about craft and culture from around the world. Let me know in the comments if you VA ever tried Faroese knitting, or if there is another textile tradition you'd love to learn about. See you next time. Spring does not burst across the Faroe Islands in a riot of color. It unfolds cautiously, like someone testing cold water with their toes before stepping in. You notice it first in the hill's greens deepen, moss brightens, and small wildflowers dare to appear between stones. The wind still travels faithfully across ridges and along fjords, but its edge has softened. It no longer bites quite so sharply through wool. You find yourself leaving the house without an extra layer, only to realize halfway up the slope that optimism can be premature. The Atlantic, after all, is nothing if not consistent in its unpredictability. Sheep graze with renewed enthusiasm, their freshly shorn coats replaced by short, fuzzy regrowth. Lambing season approaches, bringing both hope and vigilance. Mainstream agricultural history confirms that lambing in the Faroes typically occurs in late spring, time to align with improving pasture conditions. Survival rates hinge on weather too cold, too wet, and fragile new life struggles. You accompany a shepherd, checking ewes nearing labor. The hills are damp underfoot, but sunlight breaks through scattered clouds, illuminating patches of grass like stage lights. There's a quiet expectancy in the air. Historians still argue whether early Faroese settlers deliberately selected sheep breeds best suited to harsh maritime conditions or adapted existing stock gradually over generations. Genetic studies suggest long-term isolation shaped a distinct Faroese sheep lineage, resilient and well adapted to local terrain. A lamb appears almost suddenly, small and unsteady, blinking against daylight. You watch as it attempts its first wobbly steps, legs uncertain but determined. The A-way nudges gently, instinct guiding both. There's something grounding about witnessing new life against the backdrop of cliffs and sea. The wind continues its steady passage. Indifferent, yet ever-present, a quirky rural belief surfaces as you stand nearby. Some farmers once claimed that counting lambs allowed too early could confuse fortune and invite loss. Whether this reflects caution born from hard experience or simple superstition, you keep your mental tally private. Back in the village, knitting continues, though pace shifts. Outdoor tasks reclaim more daylight hours. Fences require repair after winter strain. Paths are cleared of debris. Peat stacks are assessed for future cutting. Mainstream environmental science notes that the Faroe Islands' cool maritime climate supports lush grass growth in spring and summer, ideal for grazing livestock. Unlike regions dependent on crop cycles, here pasture quality largely dictates agricultural rhythm. You carry a finished sweater outside, holding it briefly in sunlight. The fibers catch light differently than indoors, subtle shades emerging. It's satisfying to see it complete functional art born of winter labor. Historians still debate how seasonal labor distribution shaped social cohesion in small island communities. Did shared spring tasks strengthen bonds forged during winter storytelling? Or were tensions simply redistributed with new responsibilities? Human dynamics rarely follow tidy seasonal charts. Children chase one another across the hillside, laughter carried by wind. Their wool sweaters, some older, patched at elbows, move easily with them. Garments prove their worth, not in display, but in endurance. A fringe anecdote drifts into conversation. Older generations sometimes believed that if lambs played energetically in strong wind, it signaled a mild summer ahead. Animal behavior once again pressed into service as forecast. You kneel to examine a patch of newly sprouted grass. It feels soft, resilient. The land itself seems to exhale after winter's tight grip. Fishing activity increases too. Calmer days become more frequent, and boats venture farther with greater confidence. Wool sweaters remain essential, though now layered more lightly. Spring often brought renewed opportunity after winter's constraints. You walk along the harbor, noting repaired nets drying in brighter air. The sea looks less forbidding, today still vast, still powerful, but less brooding. Historians still argue whether Faroese communities historically perceived spring primarily as economic opportunity or spiritual renewal? Likely both. Survival and symbolism intertwine easily in small places. As evening approaches, now stretching luxuriously toward later, hours you sit briefly on a stone wall overlooking the fjord. The wind brushes gently past your ears, carrying faint scents of grass and salt. Sheep dot the hillside behind you. Boats rest quietly in harbor. Smoke rises lazily from turf roofs, thinner than in winter months. You realize that wool, wind, and weather are not isolated forces, but threads woven tightly together. Each season reshapes their balance, yet none disappears. Spring here is not dramatic. It is steady, persistent, quietly transformative, much like the hands that spin, knit, and mend within the village. And as lambs wobble into stronger steps, and sunlight lingers just a little longer each night, you feel the cycle turning once more, measured not by calendars, but by grass underfoot and wind across your sleeve. By early summer, the hills seem almost impossibly green, as though someone has adjusted the saturation levels on reality. You wake to light already filtering through the window, earlier than your internal clock expects. The Faroes never reach the full midnight sun of higher Arctic latitudes, but daylight in June stretches luxuriously long, lingering late into the evening in soft golden tones. You step outside and feel it immediately. Warmth that doesn't apologize. The wind still moves, of course it does, but it carries less chill, more freshness. Sheep scatter across the slopes, lambs now sturdier and bolder, testing boundaries with reckless enthusiasm. Mainstream climatology confirms that average summer temperatures in the Faroe Islands remain cool compared to continental Europe, often hovering between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius. It's hardly tropical, but after winter's damp cold, it feels generous. You walk uphill, where grass sways in synchronized waves under steady gusts. The land feels open again, expansive rather than enclosed. Summer tasks multiply quickly. Hay must be cut and dried for winter fodder. Fences repaired, boats maintained, and peat cutting resumed in drier patches. Historians still argue whether traditional Faroese haymaking techniques were more influenced by Norwegian practices or evolved distinctly due to the islands. Persistent humidity. Drying hay here requires patience and constant vigilance. Rain can undo days of work in hours. You join others spreading cut grass thinly across a sloping field. Wooden rakes move rhythmically, turning the hay to encourage even drying. Everyone keeps one eye on the sky. Clouds drift quickly, and the wind that aids drying can just as easily bring rain. A quirky old habit surfaces during a break. Some villagers once tasted the air, claiming they could detect incoming showers before clouds fully formed. While changes in humidity and pressure do subtly alter scent perception, the dramatic sniff and declare routine feels wonderfully theatrical. You pause to drink cool water and glance toward the sea. Boats move steadily in and out of harbor, summer fishing season in fuller swing. The ocean appears calmer overall, though never entirely tame. Mainstream historical records show that summer was often the most productive fishing season, allowing longer voyages and more consistent catches. Combined with agricultural tasks, it made for intense months of labor. Historians still debate how Faroese communities balanced these simultaneous demands: agriculture, fishing, textile, work without overextending themselves. Perhaps the answer lies in flexible task distribution and shared responsibility. Even textile work shifts in summer. Heavy knitting slows, but lighter item stocks, caps, repairs continue. Spinning persists when time allows. Will remains part of daily life, though less urgently needed against cold. You wander through a meadow where wildflowers punctuate the green-yellow buttercups, small white blossoms clinging low to the ground. The wind ripples through them like fingers brushing fabric. A fringe belief floats through conversation as you pass a group stacking hay. If wind remains steady from the west during haymaking, the winter ahead will be balanced, not too harsh, not too mild. Predictive symmetry again, tying present effort to future comfort. You crouch to tie a bundle of dried grass. The scent is sweet and earthy. Hay will sustain sheep through darker months, just as wool sustains villagers. Mainstream agricultural science emphasizes the importance of sufficient winter fodder to maintain flock health. A poor hay season can ripple into reduced wool quality and lower lamb survival. Every task connects. By late afternoon, sweat beads lightly at your temples, a novelty compared to winter's numb cheeks. You roll up your sleeves slightly, appreciating the rare sensation of warmth against skin. Children help gather smaller bundles, their energy boundless in extended daylight. Laughter carries icily across open fields. Historians still argue whether a long summer daylight contributed significantly to productivity increases in northern communities, or whether physical fatigue simply redistributed effort across hours. Either way, light changes behavior. As evening approaches, though evening now stretches toward nearly midnight, you sit atop a gentle rise overlooking the fjord. The sun dips low, but refuses to disappear quickly, painting the sky in soft pastels. Sheep graze quietly below. Boats rest lightly in harbor. Smoke from turf roofs rises thinly in the still air. You realize that summer here is less about heat and more about abundance of light, grass, motion. Wool production may feel less urgent, but its foundation is being secured in these fields. The wind brushes your face gently, almost playfully. For once, it feels companionable rather than adversarial. And as the sky glows, long after you expect darkness, you sense the islands exhaling, fully alive and light, sustained by grass, carried always by the faithful wandering wind. By midsummer, the rhythm of the islands feels almost buoyant. You wake before the sun fully rises because the light never truly leaves. It lingers just beyond the horizon, casting a soft silver glow, even at what your clock insists is midnight. Sleep becomes lighter, as if the body itself senses that darkness is only temporary. You step outside into air that smells faintly of salt and cut grass. The wind, constant companion, moves gently across the hills, flattening and releasing waves of green in slow succession. Sheep dot the landscape like scattered commas, chewing methodically as if unaware of the near-endless daylight. Mainstream geographic studies confirm that, while the Faroe Islands do not experience a true midnight sun, their latitude grants extended twilight during summer solstice. Civil twilight blends almost seamlessly into dawn, creating nights that feel more like elongated evenings. You'll wander toward the harbor, where preparations are underway for Olafsuka, the national celebration held each year at the end of July, though its origins are tied to the death of Saint Olaf of Norway in 1030. The festival has grown into a vibrant cultural gathering. Officially, Olafsuka also marks the opening of the Faroese Parliament, the Ligting, one of the oldest parliamentary institutions in the world. Historians widely recognize the Ligting as tracing its roots back to the Viking Age. When assemblies met in open-air gatherings to settle disputes and make decisions, historians still argue, however, about the exact continuity between medieval assemblies and the modern parliamentary structure, whether it represents unbroken tradition or symbolic revival. You notice women airing out finely knit garments, preparing them for public display. Sweaters and shawls are brushed carefully, patterns checked for loose threads. Summer may be milder, but formal gatherings still call for wool-lighter pieces perhaps, but no less skillfully made. A quirky detail emerges as someone recounts older Olafsuka customs. It was once believed that if rain fell during the opening ceremonies, it signaled a prosperous fishing season ahead. In a place where rain is practically a default setting, that's an optimistic interpretation. You help string modest decorations along a narrow street. Nothing extravagant, this is not a carnival, but there's unmistakable anticipation. Boats are tidied, decks scrubbed. Children practice chain dances in small groups, rehearsing traditional ballads that will be sung in communal circles. Mainstream cultural historians emphasize the importance of the Faroese chain dance, often performed without instrumental accompaniment. Participants join hands in a circle, stepping rhythmically while singing KVG ballads that recount heroic sagas and historical tales. It is both performance and preservation. You imagine the coming evening when villagers will gather, hands linked, moving in measured steps beneath lingering twilight. Wool sleeves brushing wool sleeves, voices rising against the wind. Historians still debate whether the chain dance remained continuously practiced throughout centuries of Danish influence or experienced periods of decline before revival. Regardless, its presence today underscores cultural resilience. You stroll back uphill, passing sheep grazing lazily in extended daylight. Lambs now look almost indistinguishable from adults, their growth astonishingly swift. The hills hum softly with insects. Another seasonal shift, a fringe belief floats through conversation as you pause near a stone wall. Some elders once claimed that dancing during the brightest summer nights strengthened wool production in the following year. The connection seems tenuous at best, but perhaps joy itself nourishes resilience. In preparation for the festival, you choose a lighter wool sweater finely spun, breathable despite its density. Faroese wool's structure allows for surprising comfort even in milder temperatures, a testament to generations of adaptation. Mainstream textile science explains that wool fibers can wick moisture and regulate temperature, making them suitable across seasons. It's easy to forget this while associating wool solely with winter survival. Evening arrives, though the sky barely dims. Villagers gather in an open space near the harbor. The wind moves gently through the crowd, lifting hair and hems. Someone begins the first verse of a ballad, voice steady, hands join. The circle forms. You step in, feeling the subtle tug as movement synchronizes left step, right step. The rhythm is simple but grounding. Wool sleeves brush yours. The ground beneath your boots feels firm and familiar. Voices rise together, carrying centuries of story across the fjord. The sea reflects pale light, barely distinguishable from sky. Historians still argue about how much of such communal rituals stem from pre-Christian Norse assemblies versus later adaptations. But standing here, you sense continuity that transcends academic categorization. Laughter ripples through the circle when someone missteps. The wind shifts briefly, then settles again. As the dance continues under a sky that refuses to darken fully, you realize that wool is not merely protection against cold, it is attire for celebration, for identity, for shared motion. Summer in the Faroes does not abandon tradition. It simply wears it more lightly. And as voices blend with wind and lingering light, you feel woven into something enduring threads of weather. Wool and community knotted together beneath an almost endless sky. Scattered across the vast North Atlantic, midway between Iceland and Norway, lies an archipelago of 18 rugged islands. This is the Faroe Islands, a land of dramatic cliffs, emerald valleys, and a spirit forged by the relentless sea. From a distance, these islands might seem like a quiet, untouched corner of the world. But life here is a vibrant tapestry woven from ancient traditions and a deep, abiding respect for nature. Our journey begins on the edge of a cliff, where the wind whispers tales of centuries past. Below, the ocean crashes against volcanic rock, a constant, powerful rhythm that has shaped both the land and its people. This is a place where human existence is intricately linked to the natural world, a relationship built on necessity, skill, and a profound understanding of the environment. One of the oldest and most defining traditions of the Faroe Islands is fowling. For generations, Faroese men have rappelled down these treacherous cliffs, a practice known as flaging. It's not just about catching birds, it's a rite of passage, a testament to courage and a vital source of sustenance. Imagine dangling hundreds of feet above the churning sea, with only a rope and your wits to rely on. The air is thick with the calls of thousands of seabirds, fulmars, puffins, guillemots, nesting in the rocky crevices. The tool of the trade is the flagging garstang, a long pole with a net at the end. With incredible agility, the fowler maneuvers the pole to catch birds in mid-flight. Every movement is precise, honed by years of practice passed down from father to son. This isn't a sport, it's a harvest. The birds caught, primarily fulmars, are a traditional part of the Faroese diet, especially during the harsh winter months when other food sources are scarce. The fat from the fulmar chicks is also rendered into oil, a precious commodity used for lighting and cooking. This practice, which might seem perilous to an outsider, is a cornerstone of Faroese identity. It speaks of a time when survival depended on looking nature square in the eye and working with it, not against it. The fowlers know the cliffs like the back of their hands. They understand the birds' nesting patterns, the shifting winds, and the subtle signs that signal danger or opportunity. It's a delicate balance, a dance between man and nature on a vertical stage. But life here isn't just lived on the edge. As we move inland from the dramatic coastline, the landscape softens into rolling green hills and deep, silent valleys. This is the domain of another Faroese icon, the sheep. In fact, the name Faroe, or Faroe Islands, is believed to mean sheep islands. And for good reason, sheep outnumber people here, almost 2 to 1. These hardy animals are more than just livestock. They are landscape gardeners, keeping the grass perfectly trimmed, and they are the source of one of the island's most cherished resources. Wool, Faroese wool, is legendary. The sheep, a unique Nordic breed, have a dual-layered fleece. The inner layer is soft and fine, providing insulation, while the outer layer consists of long, glossy hairs that repel water. This makes the wool incredibly warm, durable, and naturally water-resistant, perfect for the island's unpredictable, often damp, climate. For centuries, the rhythm of life was tied to the shearing of sheep and the processing of their wool. After shearing, the wool is sorted, washed, and carded. Then comes the spinning, a meditative process that transforms the raw fleece into yarn. You can still see women all over the islands with their knitting needles, their hands moving with a practiced, almost unconscious grace. Knitting is not just a hobby here, it's a cultural institution. The traditional Faroese sweater, or skipstruge, is a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Its intricate patterns are not merely decorative, they are a language of their own. Different villages and even families had their own distinct patterns, a way of identifying where someone was from. These sweaters were worn by fishermen and farmers, their dense, oily wool providing protection from the biting wind and sea spray. Today, these designs are celebrated as a form of national art, a symbol of Faroe's resilience and creativity. The wool industry has evolved, with modern designers blending traditional patterns with contemporary styles. But the soul of the craft remains the same, creating something beautiful and functional from the gifts of the land. This connection between the people, the animals, and the environment is the essence of the Faroe Islands. It's a circular, sustainable way of life that has endured for over 1,000 years. The birds provide food, the sheep provide wool and meat, and the land provides a foundation for it all. There's a powerful sense of community here, born from shared work and mutual reliance. When a whale is beached, the entire community comes together to process it, ensuring that nothing goes to waste. It's a system where every part supports the whole. Of course, the modern world has arrived in the Faroe Islands. You'll find high-speed internet, modern infrastructure, and a thriving contemporary music and art scene. But modernity hasn't erased the past. Instead, it coexists with it. A young tech entrepreneur might still spend his weekends helping with the sheep roundup, or a Michelin-starred chef might forage for wild herbs on the same hillsides his ancestors did. This balance is perhaps the most remarkable thing about this place. The Faroese have managed to embrace progress without sacrificing their heritage. They understand that their culture is not a museum piece to be preserved behind glass, but a living, breathing thing that must adapt to survive. The traditions of fowling and woolworking are not just relics of a bygone era. They are vital threads in the continuing story of the Faroe Islands. As we stand here, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, it's easy to feel a sense of timelessness. The wind still carries the scent of the sea and the damp earth. The sheep still graze peacefully on the hillsides, and somewhere, on a sheer cliff face, the spirit of the fowler lives on. The Faroe Islands teach us a valuable lesson, that it is possible to live in harmony with our environment, to take what we need with gratitude and skill, and to build a strong, resilient culture in the process. It's a story of survival, of community, and of an unbreakable bond between a people and their wild, beautiful home. It's a reminder that in a world of constant change, some connections are worth holding on to. Thank you for joining us on this journey to the heart of the North Atlantic. If you were inspired by the story of the Faroe Islands, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep exploring. By late summer, a subtle change begins to filter through the light. The evenings still hold their warmth, yet dusk arrives a little earlier each night, a quiet reminder that the cycles of nature never pause for long. Standing on a hillside overlooking the fjord, I watch sheep graze lazily in thick grass that has begun to lose its brightest green. The wind carries a slightly cooler edge now, a faint whisper of autumn's approach brushing against my sleeves. The work of the harvest intensifies. Hay that has dried successfully over the past weeks is now gathered and stacked, secured against the sudden showers that can sweep across these islands without warning. Securing enough winter fodder has always been one of the most critical tasks in Faroe's rural life. A poorly stored hay crop can mean weakened flocks and diminished wool yields in the year ahead, a harsh consequence for any lack of foresight. I help lift the bundled hay, feeling the satisfying weight of it, and layer it carefully into a simple storage structure. The design allows air to circulate while still shielding the hay from rain. Every motion feels deliberate, honed by generations of experience. We all know how quickly the weather here can shift. A single storm could undo weeks of effort, turning precious food into useless, sodden waste. Historians still debate whether traditional Faroese hay storage techniques were primarily influenced by Scandinavian models, or were uniquely adapted to the island's persistent humidity. The method reusing a compact stack with careful ventilation feels like a physical manifestation of centuries of trial and error, a solution perfected by time and necessity. As we work, the sheep wander nearby, their fleeces noticeably thicker than they were just a few months ago. The regrowth is steady, a testament to nature's relentless rhythm. It wastes no time in preparing for what's to come. During a short break, to catch our breath, a quirky rural saying surfaces in conversation. If the wind hums low during stacking, the hay will sleep dry. No one quite explains how hay might sleep, but I appreciate the poetic reassurance it offers, a little piece of folklore to ease the mind. I pause to stretch my back, my gaze drifting toward the sea. Fishing boats move steadily across the calm water. The peak of the summer fishing season is beginning to taper off, but the catches remain consistent for now. It's a reminder of the dual economies that sustain life here. By the late 19th century, fishing had surpassed agriculture as the Faroes' dominant industry. Even so, sheep and wool remained foundational, woven into the very fabric of identity and survival. Historians still discuss whether this economic shift fundamentally altered rural life or simply layered new responsibilities onto existing rhythms. From my vantage point, watching the boats on the water and the sheep on the hills, it seems less like a replacement and more like a careful expansion of a deeply rooted way of life. Back in the village, as the daylight hours shorten, wool production resumes a stronger presence. Inside the houses, freshly spun yarn waits patiently for needles, piled in soft, promising mounds. Sweaters that were begun earlier in the summer, set aside during the busiest days, are picked up again with renewed focus. I find a comfortable spot by the open doorway, knitting while watching the clouds roll in from the west. The air smells faintly metallic, a sure sign of incoming rain. The wind strengthens slightly, tugging at the loose strands of my hair. As my hands work the needles, another piece of local wisdom drifts through the conversation. Their essay fringe belief that if the first autumn storm arrives before the sheep S-fleece has thickened fully, the winter will be especially cold. It's another beautiful example of how close observation transforms into prediction. How people learn to read the subtle language of the land and the animals. And then, the rain begins. It starts lightly, tapping gently against the turf roofs and ancient stone walls. I move indoors, settling near the hearth. The fire crackles gently, more out of habit than any real need for warmth just yet. Climatology confirms that autumn in the Faroe Islands often brings increased rainfall and stronger winds as the Atlantic storm systems regain their strength. The transition from summer's relative calm to winter's intensity can be gradual, a slow turning of the seasons, or it can be abrupt, arriving with the force of a sudden squall. Historians have often wondered whether earlier generations perceived autumn primarily as a time of preparation or one of quiet anxiety. Written accounts are sparse, but the oral histories that have been passed down often emphasize a deep sense of vigilance, of watching and waiting. I glance at the growing sweater in my lap. The pattern feels familiar now, my hands moving with the ease of muscle memory. Outside, the rain intensifies for a moment, drumming against the windows, then softens again into a steady, persistent drizzle. Children dart in from the outdoors, their cheeks flushed, shedding their lighter wool layers near the door. The house fills with that faint, earthy scent of lanolin again as their damp garments begin to dry by the fire. It's a smell I've come to associate with comfort and safety. I realize that wool serves not just as a shield against the deep cold of winter, but also against autumn's damp unpredictability. Its incredible fibers can absorb a significant amount of moisture without surrendering their warmth. In a place where rain is less an event and more a constant companion, that quality is profoundly important. The wind shifts direction, rattling the door slightly before settling into a low moan. I listen instinctively, measuring its tone and force. Experience has tuned my senses to these subtle changes, just as it has for everyone who lives here. Every sound, every shift in the air tells a story. The hay now rests securely protected from the elements. The sheep graze contentedly on the darkening hillsides. The piles of yarn accumulate steadily in baskets by the fire. Out on the water, the boats continue their measured journeys, bringing home the ocean's bounty. Autumn approaches not as an adversary to be feared, but as a clear and steady signal. It's a call to action. Prepare, store, knit, repair. It's a time for gathering and for reinforcing our defenses against the coming cold. As evening deepens and the rain eases into a soft, enveloping mist, I add another row to the sweater in my lap. I can feel its weight growing, becoming more solid and reassuring with every stitch. Outside, the hills darken, their outlines gradually blending with a sky of muted gray. The sea and the sky become one. The cycle turns again, subtle but undeniable. And here, wrapped in wool and the steady rhythm of habit, I feel a sense of peace. We are moving with it, not against it, gathering warmth and strength in advance of the colder winds yet to come. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey, please like and subscribe for more stories from the edge of the world. By the time autumn settles properly over the islands, you've learned to hear it before you see it. The wind carries a deeper tone now, less playful than summer's breeze, more purposeful. It hums along turf roofs and threads itself through stone walls, as though checking for weaknesses. You pull your sweater tighter, not dramatically. Just instinctively, step out into the village morning. This is the season when architecture proves its worth. The traditional Faroese house, with its low stone base and thick turf roof, isn't picturesque by accident. Mainstream architectural historians agree that these grass-covered roofs evolved out of practical necessity. With almost no native forests, timber was scarce and often driftwood or imported. Turf, however, was abundant. Layered over wooden beams and birch bark, it provided insulation strong enough to soften winter's bite. You stand beside one such house now, its roof lush with grass that sways gently in the wind. Sheep graze so close they almost appear to be mowing Eton image that feels like the islands winking at themselves. Historians still argue whether sheep were ever intentionally allowed to graze directly atop turf roofs or whether that's a charming exaggeration tourists adore. Either way, you're fairly certain today's homeowner would prefer them to stay at ground level. You run your hand along the cool stone wall. The structure sits low to the earth, crouched against the wind. There's nothing flashy about it. That's the point. Wind here is not a passing inconvenience. It's a constant negotiation. A neighbor adjusts a wooden shutter, securing it before the afternoon. Gusts strengthen. Windows are small for a reason. Heat must be kept in, drafts kept out. In a place where Atlantic storms can surge in quickly, design becomes survival strategy. The turf roof acts as insulation, absorbing sound so thoroughly that rain above becomes a gentle murmur rather than a drum roll. You can understand why some locals joke that their houses wear sweaters too. Mainstream records show that many of these turf houses date back several centuries, though most have been repaired and rebuilt repeatedly. Preservation efforts in the 20th century aim to protect remaining examples as cultural heritage, especially as modern materials became more accessible. Historians still debate how early Faroese builders adapted Scandinavian longhouse traditions to these smaller, wind-exposed islands. The original Viking longhouses were larger communal spaces. Over time, Faroese homes evolved into compact, separate dwellings clustered tightly together for mutual shelter. You step back outside as clouds gather overhead. The village seems arranged deliberately, houses positioned to shield one another. Wind curves around corners, but rarely barrels straight through. Even pathways follow contours that minimize exposure. A quirky old belief resurfaces as someone mentions the coming storm. If moss grows thicker on the north side of a roof, winter winds will favor that direction. It's part weather observation, part hopeful logic. You glance upward at the roof's uneven green and wonder what it predicts this year. Wool plays its quiet role in architecture too. Inside these homes, woolen tapestries hang on walls, adding both decoration and insulation. Blankets layer thickly on beds. Even floor coverings often include woven wool to trap warmth rising from below. Mainstream climate data confirms that the Faroe Islands experience frequent low-pressure systems year-round, with particularly strong winds in autumn and winter. It's not the cold alone that challenges villagers, it's the combination of wind, damp, and darkness. You walk along the edge of the settlement, where newer houses stand painted wood structures with metal roofs. Electricity hums faintly from lines overhead, modern insulation has improved comfort dramatically. Yet even these newer buildings sit low and clustered, echoing older patterns. Historians still argue whether modernization has subtly shifted the Faroese relationship with wind. Once, every creak and draft demanded immediate attention. Now, double-glazed windows and synthetic materials buffer much of that interaction. Does comfort distance people from weather's rhythm, or does it simply grant rest? You pause as a gust sweeps through, tugging at your hair and rattling a loose gate. The sheep lift their heads briefly, then return to grazing. They seem unfazed, fleece thickening with each passing day. A light rain begins quick, slanted, and unannounced. You duck back toward the nearest doorway, grateful for low thresholds and thick walls. Inside, the air feels steady again. You sit near the hearth, listening to wind hum above the turf roof. It sounds less threatening and more like a distant chorus. The architecture absorbs its force, translating it into something manageable. It strikes you that these houses are more than shelter. They're physical expressions of adaptation. Stone anchors against shifting soil. Turf insulates against cold. Wool warms bodies within. Everything works together. Outside, the rain intensifies briefly, then fades. The wind continues its steady conversation with roof and wall. You lean back, feeling the quiet strength of thick walls around you. The world beyond may swirl and shift, but here, within turf and wool, you find a calm center, and as autumn deepens its hold, you understand why these villages endure not by resisting wind outright, but by bending, insulating, and weaving themselves gently into its path. The first real autumn gale doesn't ask permission. It simply arrives in the early hours before dawn. Pressing against turf roofs and slipping its fingers beneath door frames like an impatient guest, you wake to the low, continuous roar of wind moving across the fjord, a sound so steady it almost feels like silence if silence had a pulse. You sit up, blanket pooled at your waist, and listen. The house holds firm. Mainstream meteorological records confirm that the Faroe Islands frequently experience strong low-pressure systems sweeping in from the North Atlantic, particularly between October and March. Wind speeds can climb quickly, sometimes reaching gale force without much warning. It's not Dromit's routine. You dress in layers, wool against skin, thicker wool on top, and step carefully toward the door. Outside, the village seems both awake and braced. Smoke struggles to rise straight from chimneys. Grass along the roofs flattens and lifts in waves as if breathing. Sheep clustered instinctively behind stone walls, their bodies turned away from the wind. You notice how their fleece ripples, but never parts fully. Wool is doing what wool has always done, buffering, insulating, enduring. Historians still argue whether the Faroese breed of sheep evolved specific adaptations to these persistent winds, or whether human selection simply favored the hardiest survivors over centuries. Either way, the animals you see now look built for this. You help secure a loose gate that bangs rhythmically against its post. The wind tugs at it with playful insistence, like it's trying to start a percussion section. You tighten the latch and step back, half expecting applause. Inside again, you settle near the hearth. The fire crackles steadily, its warmth concentrated and reassuring. The turf roof absorbs much of the storm's fury, transforming violent gusts into muffled sighs. It's architectural alchemy. A quirky local superstition surfaces as an elder stirs a pot over the fire. If a storm begins before sunrise, it will tire itself by dusk. If it waits until afternoon, prepare for a long night. There's no official meteorological backing for this, but in a place where forecasts were once guesswork, patterns mattered. Mainstream historical accounts note that before modern weather prediction, islanders relied heavily on observation cloud shapes, bird behavior, barometric shifts felt in joints and bones. Historians still debate how accurate these folk methods truly were, but oral tradition insists they often outperformed early instruments. You glance toward a small window. Rain lashes sideways now, streaking across glass in sharp diagonal lines. The sea beyond looks restless, whitecaps flashing between waves. Fishing boats remain tied securely at harbor. No one argues with weather like this. Modern safety standards have reduced risks significantly, yet the sea remains unpredictable. Even today, storm-related maritime incidents occur, though far less frequently than in earlier centuries. You pick up your knitting almost automatically. The repetitive motion feels grounding. Yarn slides between fingers, steady and familiar. There's comfort in creating something warm while wind rages outside. Children sit close to the fire, listening to the storm's rhythm. Someone begins telling a story not of danger, but of endurance. A tale of a winter long ago when storms battered the islands for weeks, yet every house stood firm. Historians still argue whether such stories exaggerate duration for dramatic effect. But exaggeration or not, resilience remains the theme. By midday, the wind intensifies briefly, rattling shutters with renewed energy. You check them carefully. Everything holds. A fringe belief floats through conversation. Some claim that sheep sense the strongest gusts minutes before they arrive, lowering their heads in unison. You glance outside. The flock does indeed seem synchronized, but perhaps that's just shared instinct. As afternoon creeps forward, the gale begins to lose its sharpest edge. Rain softens to drizzle. The roar drops to a steady hum once more. You step outside cautiously. The air feels scrubbed clean. Clouds move swiftly, but no longer violently. The village stands intact, roofs steady, walls solid, haystacks undisturbed. Mainstream climate studies highlight that adaptation to frequent storms shaped nearly every aspect of Faroe's life architecture. Clothing, farming schedules, even social cooperation. In isolated communities, survival depended on collective preparation. You inhale deeply, the scent of wet grass and salt fills your lungs. Sheep resume grazing almost immediately, as if nothing remarkable has happened. Wind never fully disappears here. It simply shifts personalities, sometimes playful, sometimes insistent, occasionally loud enough to demand respect. You walk slowly through the village, noting small repairs already underway. A loose board tightened, a stone repositioned. Maintenance is constant, but never dramatic. As evening approaches, the sky clears slightly in the west, revealing a narrow strip of pale light along the horizon. You feel the lingering hum of the storm beneath your feet. Not threatening now, just present, and wrapped once more in steady wool, you return indoors. Listening to wind settle into its quieter song, another day weathered, another reminder that here, survival is less about fighting the elements and more about learning their language. By late autumn, the days contract noticeably. Morning arrives reluctantly, as if the sun needs convincing, and evening slips in before you've quite finished your second cup of something warm. You wake to a dim gray sky and the soft percussion of drizzle tapping the turf roof. More polite than yesterday, Escale, but persistent all the same. You pull on thick wool socks, the kind that feel less like clothing and more like a small portable hearth. Outside, the hills seem closer in this light, their edges blurred by low cloud. The sheep move slowly across the slopes, their fleece now dense and full, shaped by months of steady regrowth. Mainstream agricultural history confirms that late autumn marks a transition from open grazing to more managed winter feeding. Hay stored carefully in late summer now becomes a satchel. You join a neighbor in carrying armfuls from the stack to a sheltered feeding area. Each bundle smells faintly sweet, like dried sunlight. Historians still argue whether Faroese farmers historically overestimated or underestimated their winter fodder needs. Records from harsher centuries suggest that occasional shortages did occur, especially during prolonged cold spells associated with the Little Ice Age. Preparation was both science and gamble. You scatter hay before the flock. They gather quickly, heads dipping in unison. Steam rises faintly from their bodies in the cool air, a quiet testament to wool's insulating magic. A quirky local observation surfaces as you work. If sheep refuse hay on the first truly cold morning, snow is near. Today, they eat enthusiastically, which feels like a small reassurance, though snow here is less dramatic avalanche and more fleeting dusting. Back inside, you help inspect stored wool. Skeins hang neatly along beams, drying fully before long winter use. The lanolin scent lingers, earthy and familiar. Mainstream textile historians note that Faroese wool retains a high lanolin content compared to many commercial breeds, contributing to its water resistance and warmth. You run a strand between your fingers. It's slightly coarse, but strong. Sweaters made from this yarn are not delicate fashion statements. They are practical armor against damp wind. If haute couture ever tried to survive a Faroese November without wool, it would surrender immediately. Even runway models would request a turf roof. Historians still debate whether the distinctive Faroese knitting style evolved primarily from necessity or aesthetic preference. The geometric patterned stars, crosses, diamonds certainly serve structural purposes, distributing tension evenly across garments. But beauty has always found its way into function. As afternoon darkens prematurely, oil lamps are lit earlier than you expect. The room glows softly, shadows lengthen across stone floors. Outside, drizzle shifts to sleet briefly, then back to rain. The weather experiments constantly. You pause at the doorway, watching tiny ice crystals dissolve almost as soon as they land. Mainstream climatology confirms that the Faroe Islands' maritime climate moderates extreme cold, yet frequent precipitation and wind amplify chill. It's not Siberian frost, it's persistent damp that seeps into inattentive layers. You return to your knitting. The sweater in progress grows heavier in your lap. Each stitch feels deliberate, meditative. Wind hums steadily beyond the walls. Less aggressive now, more companion than adversary. A fringe belief drifts into conversation. Some elders claim that knitting during the first sleet of the season ensures fewer dropped stitches all winter. You consider testing this theory, though you suspect muscle memory deserves more credit than meteorology. By early evening, darkness settles fully. Outside, only faint lantern light glows from neighboring houses. The village feels compact, intimate, each home, a small island of warmth within the larger island. You sit near the hearth, listening to rain soften again. Sheep shift occasionally outside, their presence felt more than seen. Historians still argue whether isolation fostered greater communal solidarity here than in mainland Scandinavian regions. In villages, this small cooperation wasn't optional, it was survival. Hay shared during shortage, wool traded for fish, roofs repaired collectively after storms. You sip something warm, watching firelight flicker against stone. The room holds heat remarkably well, turf and woolworking in quiet partnership. Outside, wind picks up slightly, rattling a loose latch before easing again. The rhythm feels almost predictable. No gust, pause, drizzle, calm. You think about how many generations have sat in similar rooms, listening to similar sounds. Storms differ in strength, winters in severity, but the essential cadence remains. And as you add another steady row to your sweater darkness, fully settled beyond the window, you feel less like you re-enduring autumn and more like you. Ray settling into it layer by careful layer stitch, by patient stitch wind, humming its endless lullaby beyond turf and stone. Winter does not crash onto the islands with theatrical snowdrifts or cinematic blizzards. It arrives quietly, carried on wind that feels a shade sharper each morning, wrapped in daylight that lingers for barely a handful of hours. You wake in darkness, and for a moment, cannot tell if it is early or late. The world outside your small window is a deep, patient blue. You sit up slowly, pulling the heavy wool blanket around your shoulders. The air inside the house is cool, but not biting. Turf and stone have done their work again, holding on to yesterday's warmth like a careful secret. When you finally step outside, the village feels hushed. Frost dusts the grass in a thin, fragile layer. It's not dramatic, more like a polite suggestion of winter rather than a declaration. Sheep move carefully across the hillside, their breath visible in faint white puffs. Mainstream climate records confirm that, while the Faroe Islands sit at a northern latitude, the surrounding North Atlantic currents moderate extreme cold. Average winter temperatures hover just above freezing. Snow comes and goes quickly. It's the wind, as always, that defines the season. You carry hay to the feeding area, boots crunching lightly over frosted ground. The sheep gather their thick fleece now at full winter density. You press a hand gently into one animal's side, feeling the dense warmth beneath coarse fibers. It's like pressing into a living blanket, one that occasionally bleats at you. Historians still argue whether medieval Faroe-esque winters were significantly harsher during colder climate periods, or if modern perceptions exaggerate past severity. Written records from the islands are sparse before the Reformation, leaving much to interpretation. Oral tradition, of course, insists that winters were stronger back then, which seems to be a universal human claim. Back inside, the hearth is coaxed back to life. Firelight spreads gradually, painting the stone walls in amber tones. You hang damp outer layers near the warmth, careful not to scorch wool. That faint lanolin scent returns, familiar and oddly comforting. Winter is prime knitting season. With fewer daylight hours for outdoor work, hands remain busy indoors. Mainstream textile historians note that long winters across the North Atlantic encourage the refinement of intricate knitting techniques transforming necessity into art. You settle into your place by the fire, yarn pulled at your feet. The sweater you've been working on nears completion. Its geometric patterns echoing cliffs and waves seem especially fitting now, as wind murmurs steadily beyond the walls. A quirky island saying resurfaces. If your needles sing in winter, the wind will rest. You listen carefully. Your needles do make a faint clicking rhythm, though whether that influences meteorology remains highly questionable. Still, it's pleasant to imagine wind pausing politely to admire your tension control. Outside, the light fades astonishingly early. By mid-afternoon, dusk begins its slow descent. Oil lamps are lit once more, casting small halos of steady glow. Historians still debate whether the psychological weight of long winter darkness shaped Faroe's communal culture. It extended indoor evenings foster stronger storytelling traditions, deeper social bonds. Evidence suggests that shared indoor labor and narrative became essential forms of connection. You can feel it now. Conversation flows easily around the hearth. Stories resurface dailies of storms survived, of sheep lost and found, of ancestors who navigated these same fjords without modern forecasts. A fringe belief drifts into the conversation as someone glances toward the window. If the first winter frost lingers past midday, expect 3 days of steady wind. You glance outside. The frost has already begun to melt, which feels like a small mercy. The sea beyond the village remains restless, though fishing continues when conditions allow. Modern boats, equipped with advanced navigation tools, venture out more confidently than their wooden predecessors ever could. Yet no technology eradicates the Atlantic's authority. You pull the final stitches through your sweater's collar, completing it with a quiet satisfaction. You lift it, feeling its weight and density. This garment is not simply clothing. It is accumulated time, stored warmth, patterned memory. You slip it on. The wool settles against your shoulders, slightly scratchy at first, then reassuring. It fits well snug, but not tight. Wind may press against it later, but it will not pass icily through. Outside, night fully claims the sky. Stars flicker briefly between fast-moving clouds. The village lights glow softly, each house a warm pocket within the cold dark. You stand for a moment at the doorway, wrapped in your finished sweater, listening to the low hum of winter wind. It is not hostile, it is simply present, constant as breath. And as you step back inside, closing the door gently behind you, you realize that winter here is less about conquering cold and more about cultivating warmth through wool, through walls, through shared quiet resilience that carries you steadily into the long, patient season. Winter deepens not with spectacle, but with stillness. You wake one morning to a silence so complete it feels padded. The wind, which has been your constant companion humming, rattling, testing, has finally paused. You sit up slowly, listening. No whistle along the eaves, no low Atlantic roar, just a quiet, so thick it seems, almost visible. You step outside carefully. A thin layer of snow rests across the hills, softening every contour. It isn't dramatic, not a towering drift or blinding storm, just a delicate veil. The turf roofs wear whitecaps like elderly scholars who have finally decided to embrace wisdom. Even the stone walls look gentler, edges rounded by frost. Mainstream meteorological records confirm that heavy snowfall is relatively rare in the Faroe Islands due to the warming influence of the North Atlantic current. When snow does settle like this, it often melts within days. That impermanence makes mornings like this feel borrowed, fragile. You inhale deeply. The air is cold but clean-edged with salt from the sea. Sheep stands scattered across the hillside, their dark shapes contrasting sharply against white ground. Steam rises faintly from their wool as sunlight pale and tentative touches their backs. Historians still argue whether such quiet winter mornings were considered blessing or warning in earlier centuries. Snow could mean insulation for grass beneath, protecting spring growth. Or it could signal a harsher stretch ahead. Interpretation depended on experience and, perhaps, optimism. You walk slowly through the village. Footsteps compress snow with a soft crunch. Doors open cautiously. Neighbors exchange nods that carry unspoken acknowledgement. We made it through another storm, another cycle. Inside, fires burn steadily. The scent of peat smoke mingles with wool and warm bread. Your sweater freshly completed rests comfortably on your shoulders, already molding itself to your shape. It feels less like clothing now and more like a quiet companion. A quirky old belief surfaces as someone glances at the snow-covered hills. If winter's first true snowfall arrives without wind, spring will come gently. It's the kind of hopeful forecast that requires no barometer-only patience. You sit near the window, watching light shift across the fjord. Ice does not form thickly here, but the surface seems calmer, subdued beneath pale sky. Boats rest quietly at harbor, ropes slack in the absence of gusts. Mainstream historical patterns show that Faroe's life has always revolved around adaptation, rather than conquest sheep bred for resilience. Houses shaped to crouch against wind, will spun to trap precious warmth. There were no grand fortresses built to defy weather, only steady adjustments to live alongside it. Historians still debate whether this persistent negotiation with environment fostered a distinct cultural temperament: pragmatic, understated, patient. You suspect the answer lies not in grand declarations, but in small daily rituals repeated across centuries. You add another log to the fire and let yourself settle deeper into the chair. The room glows softly. Outside, snow reflects light upward, brightening even the narrowest alley between houses. Your breathing slows. You think of spring shearing yet to come, of hay drying in summer winds, of autumn storms rattling shutters, of winter knitting by lamplight. The cycle never rushes, never stalls. It simply turns. Wind will return soon enough. It always does. The Atlantic will resume its steady conversation with cliff and roof. Sheep will graze, fleece thickening and thinning with seasons. Yarn will pass through hands, stitch by patient stitch. For now, though, there is this pause. You rest in it. The snow begins to soften by late afternoon, tiny droplets forming along turf edges. The white veil thins, revealing green beneath. Impermanence again quietly reliable. As evening approaches, lamps glow once more, but tonight the air feels lighter. The silence lingers just a little longer. You lean back, sweater warm against your skin, fire steady before you. The hum of winter feels gentler now, almost like a distant lullaby woven through wool and wind and weathered stone. And as darkness settles softly over fjord and hillside, you allow the rhythm of these islands of sheep and storms and steady hands to carry you somewhere quieter still. Your thoughts drift like slow-moving clouds. Your breathing evens with the faint crackle of embers. The wind, when it finally stirs again, does so gently less a roar, more a whisper threading through grass and turf. Everything continues. Everything endures. And wrapped in wool beneath patient roofs, beside a fading fire, you rest inside that continuity calm, steady, unhurried. Let the hills blur. Let the sea hush. Let the wind soften to a breath. You are warm. You are sheltered. You are carried by the quiet persistence of wool, wind, and weather.